Section 1 of The Story of Minot's Light. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. Introduction. It is a strange story that I am going to tell you about a lighthouse erected far off the shore on a dangerous, partly submerged ledge, which had already taken the lives of hundreds of people. The tale begins long before the powerful white men started on their conquest of America and closes with the present day. To you who have visited Minot's Light and fallen under its magical spell, I need no excuse for writing this book. To others, I suggest a trip to the Massachusetts coastline where the lighthouse is visible. Then, as the sun sinks in the west and twilight gathers, look out on the ocean at the great stone tower, which seems to rise like a majestic sentinel out of the sea. When the light in the tower begins its well-known flash of 143, I believe you will understand my reason for the story of Minot's Light. Early history. Far below us, the sea was gathering for a mighty surge. The wind, quiet in the forenoon, had been increasing in intensity until it was now almost gale force. Away into the distance, great waves were breaking, and on the ledges off the shore, white foaming crests were in sharp relief to the scene we viewed from the top of Minot's Ledge Light. Then, with the sound of a muffled cannon roar, the billow struck. The immense Granite Tower quivered as the ocean momentarily reclaimed the ledge for its own, while we experienced a great but terrifying thrill when tons of water engulfed the base of the structure. Such was our introduction some years ago to the most dangerous lighthouse in America. That morning we had arrived at the ledge. Because the sea, breaking against the tower, made landing a hazardous undertaking, we stood off until the loop of rope was lowered. Then the keepers hoisted us, one by one, up against the outside of the tower in the impromptu sling until we gripped the ladder high above the waves. The gale soon attained such velocity that the skipper of our boat was obliged to seek less perilous waters. Meanwhile, we were marooned on top of Minot's Light. Because of the shelving ledge, the waves at half-tide are usually more spectacular than when the tide is high. The wind increased, and the billows were breaking with such savage fury that by early afternoon we were looking upon the sea in one of her angry moods. As we watched the waves sweep by, each of us was seized with a childlike helplessness which we shall always remember. A fortunate shift in the wind later that afternoon quieted the waves to some extent, allowing our skipper to return to the ledge. The keepers then lowered us into our waiting boat, and as we sailed away, our captain gave 3 farewell blasts on his whistle. While the assistant keeper waved in answer to our signal, the head keeper sounded 3 hammer-like strokes on the gigantic fog bell in the lighthouse, and we realized our visit was over. We had joined the favored few who have watched a gale from the top of Minot's Light. On our way back to Boston, we could not help but consider the dire predicament of a ship caught near the Cohasset reefs without the warning flash from Minot's Light to guide it away. We thought of the countless unfortunates lost before the great tower was built, and wondered just how many ships had been wrecked in the vicinity. The exact number of shipping disasters to take place on or near Minot's Ledge will never be known, but a list and description of the more important wrecks will be given later in this volume. Before discussing the shipwrecks, we shall cover the early history of the ledge. For countless centuries, the Indians of Cohasset and Scituate were in sole possession of the rocks and ledges off the shore. Without doubt, many thrilling events took place there before European voyagers set foot upon this continent. Some of the important incidents remembered for a time by the Red Men were partly forgotten as the years went by. We must realize that Indian legends are at best scattered fragments of these incidents, distorted and enlarged by the passage of time. Nevertheless, they still contain elements of truth which should be preserved. That is why they are included here. We are told that the early Indians naturally wanted to appease those who, they believed, controlled their destinies. Many red men thought that Hobbamock, the evil one, caused their storms and gales, and were of the opinion that he would be lenient if they presented him with gifts from time to time. Another belief was that an old Indian spirit lived out in the water under one of the rocks. Offerings were brought to this being every few months to prevent the occurrence of terrible storms. When the gales did come, the Indians felt they had wronged this supernatural being and that the storms were his revenge. It is said that the local savages from the mainland visited Cohasset rocks with trinkets, beads, and arrowheads, which they placed on the ledge for the Great Spirit. Champlain, the picturesque French adventurer, sailed fairly near Minot's Ledge on Sunday, July 17, 1605. In the account of his thrilling trip around North America, he mentions the fact that his Indian guides left small offerings at several locations to appease their gods. Another European who had much to do with the Indians was the colorful Captain John Smith. In the summer of 1614, he sailed down the coast from Monhegan Island, visiting about 40 Indian villages. John Smith was the first to mention the Indian tribe of Cohasset, from which the name Cohasset, as well as Cohasset, is derived. Minot's Ledge itself is one of the Cohasset rocks. Captain Smith had a narrow escape from death while visiting in what is now Cohasset. Because of a quarrel between the natives and his sailors, the Indians ambushed him on his way out of the harbor. His boat, approaching the open sea near Hominy Point in Cohasset, became the target for many arrows shot by the red men. Smith retaliated by firing his gun at the natives, and in his account says that he killed one of them and injured another. They continued out to sea without further trouble. Many believe that Smith Rocks off the shore have some connection with this incident. Miles Standish, the brave Plymouth soldier, carefully avoided the rocks off Cohasset when he made his way up the coast from Plymouth, September 18, 1621. His party of 13 sailed right by the Cohasset ledges on the trip to Boston Harbor, where they went ashore at Thompson's Island the next morning. With the coming of the Puritans to Boston in 1630, the need for a good chart of the seacoast became apparent. In 1633, John Winthrop himself made a map of Greater Boston Harbor, in which he included the coastline from the Merrimack River to a point south of Cohasset. For the first time in history, the ledges around Minot's were indicated, as the Massachusetts governor gave definite outline to at least 6 on his map. These ledges off the rock-bound coast of Cohasset will always be dangerous reminders of the perils of the sea. It is probable that, since the earliest times, few years went by without a wreck or fatality on the Cohasset reefs. One of the early shipwrecks along the coast was that of the sloop owned by Captain Anthony Cullimore, a noted citizen of the 17th century. When he sailed from Scituate to Boston with a load of wood, December 16, 1693, Cullimore had with him his friend Ephraim Turner and 4 passengers, including a woman. Thinking himself in safe waters, Cullimore cut inside of Minot's Ledge, and the boat hit a sunken reef. The sloop went down, and all on board were thrown into the water. One by one, they sank beneath the waves and were drowned. When news of this tragedy reached the people of Boston, a friend of Captain Cullimore printed a broadside about the shipwreck. The complete title of the broadside is somewhat unusual. Threnodiia, or A Mournful Remembrance of the Much-to-be-Lamented Death of the Worthy and Pious Captain Anthony Cullimore. Incidentally, the reef where Cullimore struck is known today as Cullimore's Ledge. In the middle of a dark and perilous night in February 1793, when a violent northeast gale was lashing the coast, the ship Gertrude Maria of Denmark crashed on or near Minot's Ledge. She gradually eased off into deep water and then brought up against Brush Island near the Cohasset shore. 2 of the crew attempted to reach the mainland in a small boat, but it overturned, and 1 was drowned. The desperate men then let down a spar across the bow of the ship to the island, where the mast hit a ledge jutting out above the reach of the highest waves. One by one, the men precariously made their way across the spar to safety. After reaching the island, they huddled together, frozen and wet, and waited for the dawn. In the early morning, the men of Cohasset saw the wreck and launched several boats into the heavy surf. One craft capsized, but the others reached Brush Island. As soon as the frozen men were taken to the boats, the dangerous row back to the mainland began. There were many narrow escapes and dangerous moments, but finally every survivor was landed and taken to shelter. When the cargo from the great ship began to wash up on the shore, it was collected by the Cohasset people, who later sold the goods at auction for $12,000, which was given to the ship's captain. This so pleased the officer of the Gertrude Maria that he promised to do something unusual for the Cohasset men who had been so kind to him, not only in saving his crew and afterwards sheltering them, but also in selling the cargo which they had salvaged from the sea for him. The captain kept his word, for when he returned to Denmark, he gave a wonderful account of the brave Cohasset citizens to the King of Denmark. His Majesty was so impressed by the captain's story that he ordered special medals cast for the 14 outstanding men who had assisted in the rescue and subsequent harboring of the Danish sailors. It was a great day in Cohasset when the medals from the King of Denmark arrived at the seaside village. The next wreck worthy of note involves an outstanding Cohasset family by the name of Bates. The schooner of Samuel Bates hit the rocks around Minot's Ledge and went down October 24, 1801. The owner and 3 others perished. It is said that Bates Ledge now marks the approximate location of the wreck. Incidentally, 63 years later, Thomas Bates, Samuel's relative, was assistant keeper at the lighthouse built near the scene of the tragedy. In 1811, with the coming of prosperity to the fishing fleets of Scituate, the government built Scituate Light on Cedar Point at the entrance to the harbor. Many thought that the new lighthouse would materially reduce the number of shipwrecks in the vicinity. It is true that the Scituate fishing fleet found safe haven inside Scituate Harbor when guided by the gleam of the lighthouse beacon, but shipping losses in the vicinity actually increased rather than decreased. The reason was that many captains sailing for Boston mistook the rays from Scituate Light for those of Boston Light. Setting their courses accordingly, they later crashed on the ledges on or near Minot's Rock. And yet it was many years before agitation grew strong enough to improve this perilous state of affairs. Meanwhile, wreck after wreck piled up on the ledges off the Cohasset shore. On September 1st, 1815, 22 days before the great September gale of that year, a vessel went down near Minot's Ledge. 5 men were drowned, but 2 others clung to the spars 11 hours until they were rescued by the men of Cohasset. Incidentally, it may be of interest to note that the 2 great hurricanes of New England, those of 1815 and 1938, produced no unusually high seas or marine disaster in the area around Minot's Ledge. Another tragedy at the ledge was added to the list of shipwrecks on December 6, 1818, when a northeast storm hurled the bark Sarah and Susan against Minot's Rock. Loaded with hemp and iron, the bark split in 2, fore and aft, the superstructure breaking away from the keel and bilges. The crew of 13 clung desperately to the wreckage as the vessel drifted toward the shore, but 4 were drowned before help came. The others were rescued by volunteers from Cohasset. During a heavy snowstorm on April 12, 1831, the schooner Boston of Hartford sailed safely by Minot's Rocks, but crashed on Chest Ledge. The captain, lashed to the mast because of the mountainous waves, had cut himself away when the ship struck. Just as he freed himself, a gigantic roller broke over the vessel and swept the length of the schooner. When the sea subsided, the captain had disappeared. Back on the Cohasset shore, a lifeboat was made ready and launched into the breakers. Captained by George W. Collier, the boat finally reached the doomed schooner, and the other sailors were removed. 2 weeks later, the body of the captain floated ashore. For the rescue of the crew of the Boston, the Massachusetts Humane Society afterwards rewarded the members of the Cohasset lifeboat crew with gold medals and a sum of money. On July 28, 1831, a strong south wind sent a vessel loaded with wine from Malaga on the rocks at Minot's Ledge. She slid off and filled at once, but the crew escaped. Not quite 3 years later, on January 6, 1834, the brig Leonidas struck the same ledge and lost her rudder. The sea was not severe enough to prevent the packet boat, which came along at that time, from successfully towing the Leonidas into Marblehead Harbor. Inspector I.W.P. Lewis probably visited a majority of the lights along the Massachusetts coast during the time that he was representing the government in this section. On many of his trips, he passed close to the Cohasset ledges and visited Scituate Light several times. In 1843, he listed the wrecks which had taken place in the vicinity from 1832 to 1841, counting over 40 on neighboring reefs in that period. Lewis declared that there was greater need for a lighthouse on Minot's Ledge than on any other part of the New England coast. The loss of lives and property here have been annual and will continue to occur until a light is established and the one at Scituate suppressed, was his statement. The sea captains of Boston now decided that definite action was necessary. Back in 1754, they had formed a fine organization known as the Boston Marine Society, and the captains chose this society as the medium through which they could best carry out their plans. Because of the activity of the Boston Marine Society and Inspector Lewis's report, the government finally took an interest in the possibility of a lighthouse at Minot's Ledge. Cohasset citizens and many others favored the construction of a stone tower, similar to the Eddystone Light off the coast of England. It was decided to send a competent engineer to Minot's Ledge and await his report on the technical side of the problem. End of Early History. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 2 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Building of the Tower. Down in Connecticut, at the entrance to Black Rock Harbor, Captain William H. Swift of the United States Engineers had completed an iron, stilt-like lighthouse tower with a keeper's room and lantern at the very top of the edifice. He was proud of his work, and it was adjudged a success. Captain Swift was now chosen to visit Cohasset and give his opinion on the possibility of building a light off the shore. After his arrival in Cohasset, Swift asked Captain Daniel Lothrop, a prominent underwriter's agent, to make a list of the shipping losses from 1817 to 1847. On April 15, 1847, Captain Lothrop presented him with the accompanying impressive list of ships, barks, brigs, ketches, and schooners lost in the general vicinity of Minot's Ledge. In addition to the list of disasters, there were 15 other vessels which suffered partial damages totaling $21,000, making in all a total of $364,000. At least 40 lives were lost in the shipwrecks. With such an outstanding loss of lives and money in the short space of 30 years, we realize why there was so much agitation for a beacon to guide the mariners past these treacherous reefs. After visiting various locations around the Cohasset shore, Captain Swift decided that Minot's Rock was the only suitable place for the proposed lighthouse. He argued against the stone tower, however, because there was not enough of the exposed surface of the rock available for the base of such a structure. Nevertheless, it is only fair to point out that later, after Swift's lighthouse had crashed into the sea, exactly the same location was used for the erection of the new stone tower. Captain William H. Swift believed in the theory of the iron pile light. This principle states that a lighthouse built on iron piles offers less resistance to the waves, which pass harmlessly through the uprights, than a stone tower against which the waves break with the full power of the sea behind them. He strongly urged this open work style, and it is possible that his extreme enthusiasm decided the issue. Another point in the government's final decision was that iron was suitable economically. When Swift's report reached his superiors in Washington, it was during a period at the Capitol when economy was the watchword. It had been estimated that the Iron Tower could be built for $30,000, while the magnificent granite edifice, which was later erected, cost over $300,000. The government chose economy and, it seemed to some, abandoned safety. After careful consideration, Captain Swift was told to proceed with his plans for an iron lighthouse on Minot's Ledge off Cohasset. It is impossible to overemphasize the extreme danger of Swift's undertaking. Conditions at the sea-swept ledge at Minot's Rock were at all times hazardous. Barely 25 feet wide, the ledge exposed at low tide was dry only 2 or 3 hours a day, and it was on this narrow rock that Swift planned to erect a 75-foot structure. He was faced with difficulties which would have discouraged the ordinary engineer. The men could work only on very calm days when the tide was at its ebb. After several reconnaissance trips had been made, the workmen landed machinery on the ledge from a schooner. Usually, unless it was too rough, the boat remained near the rock. When the daily work was finished, the men went aboard the schooner for the night. In this way, much valuable time was saved. If a storm threatened, the craft sailed into Cohasset Harbor to await less tempestuous weather. Swift made his plans carefully. 9 holes were to be drilled, 12 inches wide and 5 feet deep. 8 of them were to be placed in a circle whose diameter approximated 25 feet, while the 9th was to be located in the center of the circle. Iron piling 10 inches in diameter would later be cemented into each hole, after which braces would be constructed to strengthen the piling. The story of drilling through the solid rock out on the isolated ledge is one of constant struggle against the elements. A triangle was set on top of heavy spars and supported a platform high above the rock. On this platform, the drilling machinery was installed. The cutting edge of the drill was in the shape of a Z and fitted to a 600-pound iron shaft 30 feet long. The machine was technically described as having a wheel and axle furnished with tooth and pinion and a crank or windlass at each end. The contrivance was placed on a frame of strongest oak and required the combined strength of 4 men to operate. A cam and flywheel were attached to the axle, and with each revolution, the drill went up and down about 8 inches. When in operation, the drill usually made about 50 strokes a minute. 4 men worked 20 minutes each shift on the drilling machine. Engineer Swift asserted that the holes were fashioned perfectly, but it was not entirely a simple job of mechanics. The triangle and drilling machinery were swept from the rock by 2 different storms during the first summer of 1847. On several occasions, the workmen were thrown into the water by great waves which swept unexpectedly across the ledge, but none was drowned. It was indeed remarkable that no lives were ever lost in the building of either the old or the new lighthouse. All summer long the workmen labored on the exposed ledge, and by October 25, 1847, when they ceased operations for the year, 34 men had worked at the rock. A daily average of 21 men toiled in danger on the ledge. About a month after work on the lighthouse had been discontinued for the winter, on the night before Thanksgiving, the great ship Alabama struck the lower part of Minot's Ledge. She then drifted helplessly about 2 miles to the eastward, where, after the crew had escaped by rowing ashore, the vessel went down in 90 feet of water. Her topgallant masts still showed above the sea, however, and presented a strange sight to passing ships. A heavy gale the following February caused the ship to break up and the masts to disappear. The Alabama had been loaded with a heavy cargo of assorted merchandise. She was considered a big ship in her day, and china, crockery, cutlery, iron, chains, carpets, fabrics, and shawls had been stored in her capacious holds. One calm day the following spring, just as the workmen were getting their equipment ready for the summer's work at Minot's Ledge, Captain George Hall was sailing near the vicinity of the wreck when he noticed a yellowish tinge in the water. He was certain he was over the wrecked ship. On his arrival in Cohasset, Hall convinced the other captains that salvage work was possible even in 90 feet of water. A special company was formed to save the cargo, with Captain Nicholas Tower in charge. Huge grasping tongs, which could be operated underwater, were built and taken to the scene of the wreck. Many crates of crockery were located on the bottom of the ocean floor where the Alabama had split open. As the tongs brought up case after case, saws, tools, and cutlery were found in perfect condition, but upon exposure to the air, rust formed almost immediately. Several Cohasset families obtained entire sets of crockery, and bowls and teapots from the Alabama are still to be seen in many homes today. The shawls which came from the wreck caused considerable merriment because of the prankish spirit of the younger generation. Many of the prominent ladies of the town were given these fine shawls, which had been underwater off Minot's Light most of the preceding winter. When the ladies of Cohasset appeared on the street with the salvaged shawls, several small boys conceived an idea which they carried out with telling effect. Running ahead, the boys hid themselves strategically near where the ladies were to pass, and as the stately forms of the women of Cohasset approached the hidden pranksters, the boys shouted at the top of their voices, "Alabama!" This became an amusing sport for the boys, but the dignified ladies were very much embarrassed. In a very few days, almost every shawl salvaged from the cargo of the Alabama disappeared from the streets of the town. Incidentally, the area off the lighthouse where the Alabama went down was known for many years as the Alabama Ground. When the last wintry gust had departed from the coast of Cohasset, and the spring sun warmed the icy water, the men returned to their unfinished work on the ledge. New spars, this time 45 feet long, were installed to support the triangle upon which the men worked. By the middle of August, the 9 holes had been drilled in the solid rock to a depth of 5 feet, and the first load of iron piling soon arrived. Originally planned to be 8 inches in diameter, 10-inch piling had finally been chosen. By September 21st, all 9 piles were placed. Because of the uneven surface at the ledge, the length of the piling varied from 35 1/4 feet to 38 3/4 feet. The outer piles slanted toward the center so that they met at the top in a circumference whose diameter was only 14 feet. About 19 feet above the rock, the piles were braced horizontally by 3 1/2-inch iron rods. Another series of horizontal braces was put in 19 feet above the first series. 8 feet below the top of the piling, there was a third set of braces made of 2 1/2-inch square iron rods. The fundamental principle involved was to allow the sea to break through the tower without giving it too much resistance. Braces planned to strengthen the lower part of the tower were never put in, as it was believed they would lessen rather than increase the general security of the edifice. Later, the structure actually broke off where these braces had been planned to go. A cast iron spider, or capping, was now hoisted up to the top of the piling. It consisted of 8 arms, one for each outside iron support, and weighed 5 tons. With the capping of the spider, the hardest part of the work was over, and only the keeper's quarters and lantern remained to be installed. Perhaps Captain Swift by this time had some slight misgivings as to the safety of his structure. He may have watched the waves hit the great ledge on a boisterous summer day, or perhaps a northeast gale impressed him with the fearful force of the breakers at the rock. The answer probably never will be known, but in a letter written in November 1848 to his superior officer, Captain J.J. Abbott, Swift recommended that the great spindle be allowed to stand a winter out at the ledge without lantern or keeper. The wintry storms could thus test the new lighthouse without risking human life. A lighthouse of similar construction, built off the English coast on Bishop's Rock, had fallen into the sea. Captain Swift had an explanation for this failure, however. The English engineers had completely disregarded the principles of a screw pile light by constructing a cast iron column containing a stairway running up through the lighthouse. This part of the structure formed such resistance to the waves that the great breakers finally battered the lighthouse into the sea. If the stairway had not been constructed, Captain Swift believed, the waves would have broken harmlessly through the iron framework. Regardless of Swift's technical explanation of the loss of the Bishop's Rock lighthouse, he probably watched his Minot's light tower with extreme nervousness that winter. Before the arrival of spring in 1849, another wreck was added to the long list of marine disasters along the Cohasset and Scituate shores. Late in January of that year, a ship bearing the musical name of Jenny Lind sailed into Massachusetts Bay. Bound for Boston with a load of cotton, the captain did not see sun, moon, or stars during the 9 days he was attempting to reach port. A driving northeast snowstorm hit the coast February 5th, and the Jenny Lind was blown past Minot's Ledge, piling up on North Scituate Beach. All members of the crew were rescued. No other great storm tested the structure that winter, and the lighthouse spindle held firmly. With this apparent vindication of his beliefs, Captain Swift recovered some of his courage and began work again in the spring of 1849. The keeper's quarters and the lantern room were soon erected, and the expensive French lantern with its 15 reflectors was installed. 21 inches in diameter, the silver-plated reflectors intensified the rays of the oil lamps. These individual lights were arranged in 2 circular rows, one above the other, appearing from the sea as a single unit of illumination. The lantern room itself, built in the form of a polygon with 16 faces, was 11 feet wide, 6 1/2 feet high, and was topped by a cast iron ventilator. The 16 plates of glass were 44 by 24 inches and 3/8 of an inch thick. Minot's light was a fixed beacon, which flashed out an arc of 210 degrees around Massachusetts Bay. When the government considered the selection of a keeper for the light, Isaac Dunham of West Bridgewater was among those interviewed. Before the final decision was announced, however, the elements interfered once more, with a violent storm hitting the coast October 6, 1849. When the storm subsided, the greatest marine tragedy in the history of the vicinity had taken place. The vessel involved in the tragedy was the St. John. Because of the famine in Ireland and the lure of opportunities in the New World, countless Irish families immigrated to Boston and New England around 1850. In many cases, ships and vessels were employed which some said had outlived their usefulness. At 5 o'clock that October afternoon, Captain Oliver, master of the St. John, was running into heavy weather off Cape Cod. During the evening, the captain headed his vessel with over 100 Irish immigrants for Boston Light, the beacon he was destined never to pass. It is said that Captain Oliver observed what he thought was Boston Light far in the distance, but when it was too late, he found he had mistaken Scituate Light for America's oldest beacon. When dawn came, Oliver wore ship and stood south. He noticed the British brig Kathleen anchored inside the ledge and sailed for the protection of a landlocked harbor. But when the gale increased, he dropped anchor outside the newly completed lighthouse. The waves surged higher and higher, and the anchors began to drag. The frightened crew cut away the masts, but foot by foot the doomed brig was swept toward the rocks. Suddenly a wave of gigantic proportions rolled toward the vessel. Carrying the brig with its screaming cargo of humanity, the breaker smashed against the rocky ledge. Ripping and tearing its way across the outer rocks, the St. John headed toward the shore. With a great shudder, the brig struck the Grampus ledge. The people of Cohasset, realizing the location of the brig, knew that few passengers could be saved. The seas were so heavy that no boats could be launched into the surf. The mighty breakers, 20 and 30 feet high, now swept through the wrecked brig. Each wave carried a dozen victims to their death until only a few survivors remained. The crew launched the jolly boat, but it was soon swamped, everyone drowning except the captain and a boy. When the longboat floated clear, 12 men, including Captain Oliver, swam over and pulled themselves to safety. It was a heart-rending scene which occurred just as the longboat started for shore. Patrick Swaney and his 11 children were swept from the brig by a huge wave. With 10 of his children drowned before his eyes, Swaney seized his youngest child and started to swim for the longboat. When he was almost there, another tremendous wave enveloped him, and father and son were never seen again. Captain Oliver now ordered the longboat to run for the nearest shore, the Glades, and 20 minutes later he landed the boat safely among the breakers. It is a strange stroke of fate which allowed the worst shipwreck in the history of the ledge to take place a few weeks before the beacon on the tower was lighted for the first time. 99 immigrants and crew members perished in the disaster. The bodies which washed ashore were buried in the Cohasset Cemetery in a special plot marked today by a great stone cross. Among the spectators who gathered on the beach during that great storm was Henry David Thoreau, who later wrote of the tragedy in his Cape Cod. An incident which Thoreau speaks of follows. About a mile south we could see, rising above the rocks, the masts of the British brig which the St. John had endeavored to follow, which had slipped her cables, and, by good luck, run into the mouth of Cohasset Harbor. A little further along the shore we saw a man's clothes on a rock. Further, a woman's scarf, a gown, a straw bonnet, the brig's caboose, and one of her masts, high and dry, broken into several places. I was surprised at the power of the waves. The largest timbers and iron braces were broken superfluously, and I saw that no material could withstand the power of the waves. That iron must go to pieces in such a case, and an iron vessel would be cracked up like an eggshell on the rocks. Thoreau's observations are of interest in view of what happened to the iron lighthouse built to prevent just such occurrences as he was discussing. Incidentally, his comments on the condition of the hull of the St. John bear repeating. Some of these timbers, however, were so rotten that I could almost thrust my umbrella through them. The framework at Minot's Light had been slightly damaged in the St. John storm, causing a delay in the lighting of the beacon. It has been said that the tower was first lighted on December 13th, 1849, but in the words of the keeper, Isaac Dunham, the lamps were lighted for the first time on January 1st, 1850. End of The Building of the Tower. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 3 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The First Lighthouse. Although the passage of almost a century has somewhat obscured the story of Isaac Dunham's 10 months at the first beacon, we are nevertheless able to mention many incidents that occurred there in 1850. We know the names of at least 2 of the men who assisted Keeper Dunham in his duties. They were his son, Isaac A. Dunham, usually confused with his father, and Russell Higgins of Eastham. As Keeper Dunham was at the First Lighthouse for a period of time almost twice as long as that of any other man, his remarks carry considerable weight. Until a few years ago, it was believed that all of the actual records at the light were lost when it fell into the sea on that wild April morning. The first logbook, however, left the light with Keeper Dunham and is now in the possession of his granddaughter, Mrs. R.A. Elliott. The story of the poor little kitten which Dunham took out to the beacon for company is a sad one. To relieve the desolate monotony of being alone in a tower built upon a rock in the ocean, Dunham brought a kitten to stay at the light with him. The little pet became frantic when it arrived at the top of the lighthouse and seemed to go mad with fear. As the great storms shook the top-heavy lighthouse, the kitten ran around and around the watchroom. Never able to adjust itself to this strange existence, the kitten ended its life at the first opportunity. One day when the sea had gone down and the 75-foot tower stood basking in the sun, Keeper Dunham thought that the little animal would benefit by going out on the sunlit platform far above the waves. After he opened the watchroom door, Dunham called to the kitten. Springing up the ladder, the kitty raced around the circular room twice, each time ignoring the wide-open door. The third trip, however, the animal appeared completely confused and scampered through the lighthouse door and across the platform. With a leap, she sprang out into space. Keeper Dunham rushed to the railing in time to see the little body struggling on the kelp-covered ledge 60 feet below. Then a wave of moderate size swept the rock, and the kitten was pulled below the surface. It is said that Keeper Dunham never brought another pet out to the rock. Excerpts from Keeper Dunham's logbook are so vivid and graphic that they need little comment. On the inside cover, he has written his name with the date December 1849, evidently the month he first came out to the light. The first actual entry in the diary seems to prove conclusively that January 1st, 1850 was the date for the first lighting. We shall quote from time to time directly out of the pages of Keeper Dunham's record, written while in the lonely tower on the ledge. January 1st, 1850, Daily Journal. Tuesday the 1st. Drawn oil for the lantern and light up the lighthouse on Minot's Rock for the first time on the night of January the 1st, 1850. Isaac Dunham, Keeper. Wednesday the 2nd. Cleansed up the lantern, all ready for lighting. Thursday the 3rd. Cleansed up the lantern for lighting. Friday the 4th. Cleansed up the lantern for lighting. Saturday the 5th. Cleansed up the lantern for lighting and broke 1 tube glass. Sunday the 6th. And drawn 12 gallons oil for lantern. Monday the 7th. Cleansed the lantern for lighting. Tuesday the 8th. Cleansed the lantern for lighting in a tremendous gale of wind. It seems as though the lighthouse would go from the rock. Keeper Dunham's assistant the first few weeks was Russell Higgins. Then, on January 26th, Isaac A. Dunham relieved his father at Minot's Light. The entry follows. Saturday the 26th, drawed 9 gallons oil for lantern. Came off in the Minot and took my first trick at keeping the light. Father has gone to Boston and will be back in 3 or 4 days. By Isaac A. Dunham. Sunday the 27th. Had our dinner today at 4 o'clock, consisting of stewed beans, coffee, duff, bread, etc. Sunday the 28th. Mr. Noyes came off to see us this afternoon. Had quite a chat and smoke. The Mr. Noyes referred to was William T. Noyes of Key West, Florida, who had aided in the construction of the tower. Later, Noyes appears in our story again, although under slightly different circumstances. Today, visitors to the light are asked to sign a registry book, which is now an interesting collection of names and places. The first visitors to sign Keeper Dunham's logbook were 3 pilots from the well-known pilot boat Cohasset. They were Elbridge G. Martin, Patrick H. Chandler, and Benjamin B. Tremon, who went ashore at Minot's Ledge Sunday, February 17, 1850. An entry scribbled beside their signatures indicates that the wind was southwest by south. One day, Keeper Dunham was having some difficulty with the reflectors and asked Mr. Hemingway, a mechanic, to go out to the light to make adjustments. On March 6th, while Mr. Hemingway was still at the station, word came from Mr. Dennison, Captain Swift's assistant, that the derrick at the light would have to be changed to give an unobstructed view of the lamps. At about 4:30 the morning of March 12th, Keeper Dunham heard someone call, "Hello!" at the foot of the lighthouse ladder. It was Captain Wilson, who had come to take Mr. Hemingway back to the mainland. Since Assistant Higgins was on duty, Dunham decided to go back with Captain Wilson for some articles which he needed. While he was ashore, the wind shifted to the east, and Dunham felt that a snowstorm was brewing. A light snow was falling, and the wind was coming up as he launched his dory for the long row to the light. By the time he arrived at the rock, a thick snowstorm from the northeast had set in. Fortunately, however, the waves had not had time to make up, and Dunham landed safely at the ledge. In his logbook, he reports, "It came on to blow 5 minutes after we got the boat hooked on, so that I could not have got on alone." Tuesday, the 19th. Quite a fleet of vessels out of Boston. Sunday, the 31st. Cleansed the lantern for lighting up for this month's ends, and I thank God that I am yet in the land of the living, and that I have been preserved during the last winter, and I hope and pray to be. March was the last month of winter, but April turned out to be as severe as any winter month. April, Friday the 5th. This day and the last night will long be remembered by me as one of the most trying that I ever experienced during my life. The wind, northeast to east, blowing very hard with the sea running mountains high. It must be that we were in the hands of a merciful God, for which I am thankful that we are yet spared. Have cleaned the light up. Saturday the 6th. The wind east blowing hard, with an ugly sea, which makes the lighthouse reel like a drunken man. I hope God will, in mercy, still the raging sea, or we must perish. We have made out to clean the lantern up. With fear and trembling. God only knows what the end will be. At 4 p.m. the gale continues with great fury. It appears to me that if the wind continues from the east, and it now is, that we cannot survive the night. If it is to be so, O God, receive my unworthy soul for Christ's sake, for in him I put my trust. Sunday the 7th. Cleaned up the lantern for lighting. The wind does blowing from the east, which leaves a tremendous sea, which seems as if it would destroy the lighthouse. I pray God to still the raging sea, if it is his will. Monday the 8th. The wind west-northwest, blowing very fresh, which will kill the ground sea. Thanks be to God for this blessed wind. This gripping document of a man in fear of his life, who consigns himself to his Maker, speaks for itself. Without question, the tower was in grave danger of toppling over on the afternoon of April 6, 1850. Although the storm soon went down, the keepers grew more and more anxious for their own safety. Keeper Dunham writes as follows: Wednesday, 17th, as usual, wind does not blow hardly any. I've stayed a good deal longer than I ought this time. Keeper Dunham's remarks were strangely prophetic when we realize that the lighthouse fell into the ocean exactly 1 year from the date of the above words. Summer brought its good weather and calm seas, but there was one rough spell in July, as will be seen in the following entry. July 2nd. Higgins came on to the lighthouse, very rough, and had to swing on a rope from the boat to the lighthouse, and my son had to swing from the lighthouse on a rope and drop on the boat. It would have frightened Daniel Webster. Keeper Isaac Dunham was so terrified by his experience during the April gale that he later wrote to the government requesting that the tower be strengthened and not allowed to succumb to the ravaging sea. This communication incurred the displeasure of the builder, Captain Swift, who professed the greatest confidence in the structure. Since the summer went by and no action had been taken to reinforce the tower, Isaac Dunham resigned as keeper of Minot's Light, October 7th, 1850. Captain Swift found another who believed in the safety of the lighthouse tower when he interviewed Captain John W. Bennett, an English sailor of 25 years' experience. Bennett, after his appointment, openly belittled the man who was leaving the service. This scoffing attitude did not make Dunham's lot a happy one. John W. Bennett's repentance came later, however, when his own words closely paralleled those of Dunham during the terrible gale. The new keeper, known as a brave and energetic man, arrived at the Rock on October 7, 1850. Retiring keeper Dunham, surfeited with the memories of many terrible storms, did not relish Bennett's charges that there had been many false statements circulated concerning the safety of the lighthouse. Dunham knew only too well how true those statements were, but he comforted himself with the thought that Bennett would soon change his mind. Keeper Bennett hired a new crew of assistants from Cohasset, an Englishman by the name of Joseph Wilson and a Portuguese named Joseph Antoine. Arrangements were continued as they had been during Dunham's regime, with 2 keepers always remaining at the light. A visitor to the Rock at this time mentioned the fact that the braces were constantly being sent to the Cohasset blacksmith shop for straightening and strengthening. Bennett, nevertheless, was still undecided about the tower. In a letter dated October 9, 1850, Keeper Bennett wrote to the Boston Journal, "I desire to withhold my own opinion until I have snuffed a good strong northeaster. Much remains to be done to secure it, the light, from accident." Keeper Bennett went on in his letter to suggest that the tower be braced by sinking iron rods into adjacent ledges, but the plan was later found to be impractical. A howling northeast storm in the late fall of 1850 completely changed Mr. Bennett's mind about the safety of the tower, and he notified Superintendent Philip Greeley that the light was in danger. A committee was assigned the duty of inspecting the structure at close hand. Unfortunately, the committee arrived during a perfectly calm sea. Observing the water lapping gently against the iron supports, and noting as well the 9 sturdily constructed iron pilings, they agreed that even in a severe storm the water would break harmlessly through the open ironwork. The committee then returned to Boston, and in the comfort and security of the big city, decided against strengthening the light in any way, because, they affirmed, the great lighthouse was capable of weathering, quote, "any storm without danger," unquote. In view of what happened later, one might be prone to criticize the members of the committee for what seemed to be inexcusable stupidity. If even one member had volunteered to spend a night or 2 at the beacon, he might have voted to strengthen the structure at once. A writer from Boston did spend a few days at the light a short time later, and his experiences were published in the Boston Journal. If a committeeman had been with him, perhaps the disaster would have been averted some months later. The writer, who called himself, quote, a gentleman from Boston, unquote, went out to the Rock in December 1850, just in time to experience one of the worst storms of the year. In a very descriptive letter, he gives an account of this gale. Quote, of the lighthouse, I was coolly told that it was very doubtful if it stood through this winter, as one of the iron supporters had split the rock, and when a sea struck the house, it shook so as to take a man off his feet, and only a week before, one of the assistants was thrown from his berth by the shock of the sea, and a barrel of water was emptied of 2/3 of its contents. But it was at daybreak, when the gale was at its height, that I got my full reward for going there. From daybreak until 11 o'clock, nothing was done by either Mr. Bennet or myself, save to gaze upon the sea. We forgot to eat our breakfast. No thought of passing time or of our situation in that racked and trembling fabric came over us. The sea was a moving mass of foam, waves rolling over waves and breakers towering above breakers, which tumbled in upon the rocks as if determined to hurl them from their place. At night, however, with every appearance of a return of the storm, we felt for the first time the utter desolation of our position. A sea set in, to which that of the morning was nothing, and shook the building so that it was difficult to stand, causing it to oscillate 2 feet each side of the center, and to make it quiver and jerk in such a manner as to make it seem impossible for the legs to sustain the 30 tons weight which rested upon them. Unquote. Keeper Bennet was now so worried that he placed a letter in a bottle, hoping that if the light fell over, the message would reach shore. In the letter he mentions that the rods in the lower part of the light have been twisted and bent. Quote, the ice is so massive that there is no appearance of the ladder. The sea is now running at least 25 feet above the level. I feel as seasick as ever I did on board a ship. Our lantern windows are all iced up outside, although we have a fire continually burning, and it is not without imminent peril that we can climb up outside to scrape it off, which I have done several times already. I have a dread of some ship striking against us, although we have kept the bell constantly ringing all night. Our water is a solid mass of ice in the casks, which we have been obliged to cut to pieces with an axe before we could obtain any to drink. Our situation is perilous. If anything happens before day dawns on us again, we have no hope of escape. But I shall, if it be God's will, die in the performance of my duty. Unquote. When Bennet's letter and the letter of his visitor appeared in the Boston Journal, there was one man who was definitely upset. He was Captain W.H. Swift, who had built the lighthouse. In spite of the apparently serious condition at the light, he wrote a long article as late as January 9th, 1851, explaining why the lighthouse could not possibly fall over. 2 months after this article appeared, the light fell into the ocean, drowning both keepers. On Sunday morning, March 16th, the inhabitants of Boston witnessed the beginning of another terrible storm. An extremely high tide overflowed the wharves and piers of the city, causing considerable damage to the cellars of warehouses. Streets were flooded by the rising sea, and Boston became an island when the areas around Boston Neck were inundated. But out at Minot's Light, 18 miles from the city, conditions were much more serious. The keepers were awakened at 2 o'clock that morning by the rising wind and heavy snow pelting against the lantern. With the coming of dawn, a wild scene presented itself to the 2 men. As far as their eyes could see, the ocean was in great turmoil. By night, the storm had become a gale, and when dawn of the second day broke, it was not safe to stay in the lantern room. The 2 men climbed down the ladder leading to the storeroom, located under the keeper's quarters, as they feared the upper part of the lighthouse would go over. Here, a room had been built at the top of the piling for the storage of fuel and food supplies. The two frightened men cowered in the storeroom under the light for 4 days and nights. At frequent intervals, a lamp chimney or reflector smashed to the floor 2 stories above them, and one of the keepers attempted the perilous climb up the ladder inside the structure to repair the damage. As they tried to reach the lantern room, they were often knocked off the rungs by the tremendous force of the waves, which caused a violent pitching of the tower. Sleep, of course, was out of the question, and uncooked meat and dry bread their only sustenance. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the wind went down somewhat, and when the tide turned, the tower was not subjected to such heavy seas as in the morning. When darkness came, the ocean had quieted appreciably, and although the great waves hit with occasional high surf, the storm was over. By morning, the lighthouse tower had ceased its racking and straining, and the keepers rejoiced at their good fortune. Soon after the abatement of the storm, Assistant Keeper Wilson flew the boat flag, as he was more than anxious to enjoy his long-overdue leave. When the relief craft came out, he set sail for the mainland, leaving Principal Keeper Bennett and his assistant, Joseph Antoine, at the light. A few days later, Wilson visited Boston. During his stay in the city, a friend asked him whether it would be difficult to hire another capable man for the position in the event Keeper Bennett left the lighthouse. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I shall stay as long as Mr. Bennett does, and when we leave the light, it will be dangerous for any others to take it." The young man, only 20, was feeling rather happy that the winter was over. He was looking forward to being at the light the coming summer, with the warmth and sunshine making up for the winter of terror he had recently experienced. But the summer never came for Assistant Keeper Wilson. While he was in Boston, he was also asked what he would do if the light should fall. He answered that he was quite confident of reaching the shore. In view of what actually happened 3 weeks later, his remarks take on special significance. His final statement was that he would stay at the light as long as the tower stood. When the time came, that is exactly what happened. The head keeper, John W. Bennett, spent the next few days at the light, tightening and strengthening the braces. He found the dory smashed beyond all hope of repair, however, and made arrangements to go to Boston to purchase a new one as soon as Assistant Keeper Wilson returned from his leave. A relatively calm spell was enjoyed the first week in April, but around the 8th of that month, easterly winds began to blow. Bennett decided to leave the light when the east wind diminished somewhat, and on the morning of Friday, April 11th, he flew the signal for the boat to come out. Leaving the weakened structure in charge of the 2 assistant keepers, Joseph Antoine and Joseph Wilson, head keeper Bennett sailed away from the lighthouse, never to return, and it was the last time he saw either man alive. Arriving on the mainland, Keeper Bennett proceeded to the Custom House in Boston, where he interviewed Collector Philip Greeley concerning the purchase of his new boat. The next day, he returned to Cohasset and made an effort to reach the light, but the easterly had increased, so that a heavy sea was running at Minot's Ledge. Sunday, the wind grew stronger, and by night the surf was seen hitting fairly high against the structure on the lonely ledge. Late Monday, the wind had developed into a gale, which intensified to hurricane force by Wednesday morning. The exact course of the storm on Wednesday, April 16, 1851, was east-northeast. On the mainland, the storm was causing considerable destruction up and down the coast. Scituate Harbor was damaged to an extent of $5,000. Several houses at Pleasant Beach in Cohasset were entirely swept away. A large 3-story hotel was floated right out from its underpinning, with almost a score of guests barely escaping in time. A few moments after the occupants had left the building, the sea broke over it, smashing the hotel into 4 great sections in a comparatively short time. The storm raged all along the coast, from New York to Portland, Maine. The feeling was general that the storm brought a higher tide and greater gale than any since December 1786, when 13 people froze to death on Lovell's Island in Boston Harbor after their ship had been wrecked. The city of Boston actually became an island during the Wednesday high tide as the water came across the neck, cutting the city off from the mainland completely. On Harrison Avenue, the water was 4 feet deep, and the tide flowed entirely across Washington Street near the corner of Waltham Street. In downtown Boston, the waves swept right up State Street, with the area around the Custom House 3 feet underwater. Broad Street was partially submerged, the waves continuing up Central and Milk Streets. It is said that Merchants Row was reached by the great tide. The record high tide submerged both Charlestown and Chelsea bridges. The Evening Transcript for April 16, 1851, reported that no cars were operated over the Old Colony Railroad line that morning. Quote, "The rails have been washed up so that they lie crosswise, hundreds of feet in many places. This is believed to be the highest tide ever known in Boston. It began to recede slowly about 12 o'clock. Thousands of spectators flocked down to the wharves to witness the grand spectacle which the waters presented. Great apprehensions are felt in regard to the lighthouse at Minot's Ledge. The weather is still too misty to distinguish if it is still standing." Unquote. At the time this article was written, however, the light was still fairly upright. The two heroic keepers had continued to carry out their tasks in spite of the great odds against them. They kept the bell ringing and the lamps burning for the ships in distress outside the ledge. Their worst night was about to begin. The storm seemed to have spent its fury, but, as is so often the case, the great seas grew even higher as evening came to the men at Minot's Ledge. End of The First Lighthouse. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 4 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tragedy. No one will ever know the exact circumstances of the tragedy which befell the two brave keepers out on the rock. The following explanation is offered as a possibility. It is, however, an account in which all the known facts are put together in a sequence that may be considered reasonable. We know that several families living at the Glades in Scituate saw the gleam of Minot's light about 10 o'clock that fateful Wednesday night. Thus we may naturally assume the light was still standing at that time. The two men, realizing their danger would be greatest around high tide at midnight, prepared a message for the outside world in case they failed to survive the storm. Casting the bottle containing the message out from the lighthouse, Wilson and Antoine now made their plans for what proved to be their last night in this world. The wind had abated appreciably, but the great tide was slowly rising, sending wave after wave through the upper framework of the weakened structure. There was still that terrifying surge of hundreds of tons of foaming surf just below them. The doomed tower, rocking perceptibly back and forth, seemed about to crash at any time. Higher and higher the billows swept, until almost every wave smashed against the keeper's quarters, 60 feet above the ledge. Probably around 11 o'clock that night, the central support snapped completely off, leaving the top-heavy 30-ton lantern tower to be upheld by the already weakened outside piling. The great 5 1/2-inch rope hawser, which had been fastened into position by Keeper Bennett, ran from the top of the tower to a 7-ton granite rock located about 200 feet in the lee of the lighthouse. Keeper Bennett used this cable to get on and off the tower whenever a turbulent sea was running. The reader can best understand the system by a careful study of the accompanying picture of a descent from the lighthouse. Many believe that this cable, pulled by the huge rock as the boulder in turn was pushed toward shore by the sea, was a contributing factor in the destruction of the edifice. Keeper Bennett usually slackened the hawser when a storm came up, but it is a question whether this was beneficial to the lighthouse. If the rock started moving, the slack would soon be taken up, and until this happened, the force of the waves against the cable would be greater since the rope was not taut. With the central support cracked off, the tower became more and more dangerous. The cable attached to the rock probably had the same effect that a rope would have, tied to the top of a high tree after it is almost chopped through, with the granite block creating a pull like men trying to bring the tree down. Inch by inch, the granite block moved toward the shore, gradually increasing the strain on the 8 remaining iron supports. Without question, the lighthouse slanted at an angle of 20 degrees from the perpendicular by midnight. The previous afternoon, a man with a telescope, standing on the beach at Cohasset, was peering anxiously in the direction of the ledge. He detected a decided list toward shore when he occasionally saw the structure through the mist, and felt that the lighthouse was doomed. Just before 1 o'clock on the morning of April 17, 1851, because of the combined forces of wind, sea, and straining hawser, the great Minot Ledge lighthouse eased over into the sea. One by one the pilings broke, snapping like pipe stems, until only 2 or 3 remained. There the tower rested for a time. The keepers realized that the end was near. Wishing in some way to communicate with their loved ones ashore, they seized the heavy hammer and began to pound furiously on the great lighthouse bell. We know that this signal was heard, for many residents at the glades later recalled the sound of the bell, which came over the water to them, even above the roar of the surf at 1 o'clock that wild morning. With the tower so bent over that the storeroom and capping received the full force of each breaking wave, the remaining supports soon gave way, and the great tower plunged beneath the ocean waves. The government had made a costly mistake. The sea reclaimed the ledge for its own. But what of the 2 keepers? Letting themselves down by the hawser into the water, the 2 men, each with a life preserver strapped to his back, dropped into the boiling surf. We believe that Antoine and Wilson did come down the hawser, for the stay was later found, and from its appearance it seemed probable that the lanyard connecting it to the lighthouse had been let loose. It had been tied in such a way that only human hands could have loosened it. The body of Joseph Antoine was washed ashore soon afterward at Nantasket. The writer believes it possible that young 20-year-old Wilson tried to live up to his expressed determination of reaching land. A short distance from the glades lies Gull Rock. Here it was that Joseph Wilson was washed ashore, more dead than alive, terribly chilled and bruised by the battering of the icy waves. He crawled up to the top of the rock and discovered he was not on the mainland. This disappointment, after his long swim from the lighthouse, was too much for Wilson, and he sank, exhausted, in a cleft of Gull Rock far above the reach of the outgoing tide. He probably died before morning of exhaustion and exposure. It is not all conjecture, however, for when the body of Joseph Wilson was discovered, the position and condition indicated that the young man reached the rock alive. When Keeper Bennett had been prevented from going out to the tower, he went to his home on Whitehead near the glades. As the storm increased, the water swept across the shore and surrounded his residence, forcing the keeper to leave his home. Restless and uneasy about the fate of his fellow workers out on the lighthouse, he wandered along the beach. Around 4 o'clock the next morning, perhaps at the very time when his assistant, Wilson, was near death on Gull Rock, John Bennett began to notice debris coming ashore. He went down to the edge of the sea, and to his amazement, Bennett recognized some of his own clothing which he had left at the lighthouse. Wreckage was also coming in, and he gathered 2 or 3 fragments from the rolling breakers. His worst fears were realized when he saw that pieces of timber were actually from the light itself. The gale which caused the destruction of the lighthouse off Cohasset has since been referred to as the Minot's Light Storm of 1851. Captain William H. Swift visited the ruins of Minot's Light on April 22, 1851, and made a sketch of the ledge with the broken piling. He also drew the lighthouse tower itself as it lay in the water with only a part of the side showing. He probably experienced the bitterest moment of his life when he stood on the rolling deck of the boat and sketched the symbol of his costly failure. Included in this volume is a copy of Swift's sketch that April day. The Boston Board of Underwriters now ordered the steam towboat, the R.B. Forbes, to anchor off the rock and serve as a lightship. A temporary lighting apparatus was installed on the Forbes, and plans were made for a new lantern on the ship later in the year. But the storms were not yet over for the season. On April 20th, the lightboat was in such danger that she had to leave her station off the ledge and return to Boston Harbor until the gale went down. After a short period, the R.B. Forbes was replaced by the old Brandywine Shoal lightship, which had been anchored since 1823 inside the entrance to Delaware Bay. As a lighthouse had been built in the vicinity, the Treasury Department sent the ship up the coast to Minot's Ledge, where the vessel was moored outside the rock. Captain John W. Bennett, the former lighthouse keeper, was retained in charge of the 110-ton lightship. During an official inspection aboard the vessel, July 8, 1851, it was found that the ship was in bad condition and unfit for further duty. Nevertheless, it was not until several years later that a new ship was placed off the ledge. While the lightship was guarding the area off the rock, the bark Vesta, loaded with coal, struck the back of Gull Ledge, October 3, 1851. Since there was no serious damage, the vessel was declared seaworthy and floated off the ledge. It is said that men of Cohasset sailed her until nearly the end of the 19th century. Although not many anecdotes have come down to us about the lightship, there is an interesting account of the black Newfoundland dog which lived on the vessel with the men. The route of the various merchant ships and steamers up and down the coast carried the vessels within a few score yards of the lightship, and one day a bundle of newspapers was thrown over in the general direction of the ship. While the men made preparations to launch their dory from the lightship, the Newfoundland dog leapt into the ocean and swam for the package. A few minutes later he reached the bundle and seized the papers in his teeth. Swimming back to the lightship, he was met by the surprised men, who took the newspapers from him and helped him up into the boat. The passengers on the merchant vessel had noticed the entire episode, and soon the whole Boston waterfront knew of the Minot's lightship dog which swam for papers. It became a common occurrence for the dog to swim to the ships as they passed and to retrieve the daily papers for the men on the lonely lightship. But the elements were still to be considered. The next shipwreck, while the lightship was in position off Minot's Ledge, was that of the brig Mariel, which hailed from Belfast, Maine, and was in charge of Captain Staples. Heavily loaded with hides and turpentine from Georgia, the vessel crashed against East Hogshead Ledge, April 8, 1852. All on board were drowned. On January 29, 1853, the crew of the lightship experienced a heavy gale that later developed into a wild hurricane. Farther out to sea was the bark Maryland, bound from Baltimore to Boston with an assorted cargo. Since they were not able to reef topsails fast enough when the gale hit, the crew watched the sails blow to shreds. Driven in alongside the lightship, Captain Davis tried to anchor, but in vain. The cables dragged, and the helpless lightship crew watched the vessel disappear in the direction of Cohasset. A short time later, the Maryland piled up against the north side of Gull Ledge, slid off, and drifted toward the shore. She was driven by the gale into Briggs Harbor, where she ran aground after a weird trip, with a ship and crew narrowly escaping disaster. The bark Maryland was later floated off, and her cargo sent up to Boston on lighters. As wreck after wreck continued to come in on the Cohasset ledges, the United States government realized that action on the new lighthouse would have to be speeded up. Although the lightship was properly equipped, it could only, in a minor sense, substitute for a tower high enough to be seen from a safe distance. Plans were rushed, and by the year 1854, many engineers had drawn their ideas for a new lighthouse. A new lightship was completed in 1854 and took the place of the one formerly anchored off Brandywine Shoal. Equipped with all the latest devices and carrying a crew of 4, the Minot Ledge lightship was able to ride out the most severe storms from 1854 until the new tower was lighted on November 15, 1860. End of The Tragedy. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 5 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Granite Tower. The federal government recognized the importance of rebuilding the lighthouse at Minot's Ledge, and Congress appropriated a substantial sum of money for the purpose. The construction of the edifice was under the jurisdiction of the United States Topographical Bureau. When the Bureau advertised for bids for the lighthouse, 16 were received. Before a decision could be reached, however, the new Lighthouse Board was created. General Joseph G. Totten, at one time Chief Engineer of the United States, presented plans for a great stone tower to be built at the ledge. General Totten's design was accepted, although Captain Barton S. Alexander is said to have proposed certain radical features which were incorporated in the final design. At least we know that several of his innovations are present as the tower stands today. After the final drafts were completed, the plans were brought to Cohasset, where 2 master model makers were assigned the task of constructing a miniature of the lighthouse. Richard Bourne and Zacchaeus Rich worked on the model for 2 winters, completing it in the little shop that stood for many years at the head of Cohasset Cove. The Lighthouse Board in Washington was naturally anxious to avoid a repetition of the first catastrophe and ordered Major Ogden, an engineer, to visit the ledge and examine the surface of the rock with care. After a lengthy analysis of the seams and stratification of the ledge, Ogden finally approved of the original location where the former light had stood. Orders were now released for the actual building of the lighthouse. The most important of several considerations still remaining was the selection of a highly qualified engineer for the construction of the lighthouse. Barton S. Alexander, a tall, husky captain in the United States Engineers, was admirably fitted to superintend the building of the stone beacon. As already indicated, many of his ideas were incorporated into the plans of the new lighthouse. He was, quote, one of those men we sometimes meet who are always clear-headed, never in a hurry, but have the faculty of doing a great deal in a short space of time, unquote. Later in the Civil War, Alexander had many thousands of men under his supervision, but he was always in complete control of every engineering project to which he was assigned. Such was the man chosen in April 1855 to build America's most dangerous lighthouse. In making plans for the actual work at the ledge, Captain Alexander found that 3 conditions were necessary for successful operations. A smooth sea, a dead calm, and low spring tides were essential. The tides were right only, quote, 6 times during any one lunation, 3 at full moon and 3 at the change, unquote. The top of the rock was 3 feet 6 inches above the plane of low water. As the plans indicated, the granite blocks were to be laid under low water in 7 different places. All was now in readiness for the work at the rock. Although Captain Alexander tried to land at Minot's Ledge on May 1st, 1855, it was not until the 12th of that month that the swell had diminished enough to make this possible. Alexander's first survey showed that the ledge would have to be cut down to receive the foundation stones of the lighthouse. The space available was so limited that there was no opportunity for the placing of a regular cofferdam. Realizing that there would be many days when work at the ledge was impossible, Captain Alexander arranged to have Government Island, now connected to the mainland at Cohasset, used for cutting and assembling the granite. The same gang of workers would do both jobs, and in that way work full-time. The first active work was undertaken at the rock on June 20th, 1855, when the old stumps of the first tower were wrenched from their sockets. A large part of the structure, which was still underwater a few hundred yards away, also had to be removed so that boats could more easily approach the ledge. Captain Alexander writes in his notes about the building of the light that on visiting the ledge for the first time, he decided to remove all trace of the former disaster as soon as possible because of the unfavorable effect on the morale of his workmen. A daring Scandinavian named Peter Fox volunteered to go down and locate the fragments of the wreck. Diving underwater with a light tackle, he hooked it around a piece of the old tower and swam up to the surface with the line. Then the other workers brought up the heavy iron by means of this line until the entire wreck was removed. It is said that the old tower was broken up and made into nails at an East Bridgewater factory. At daylight, Sunday morning, July 1st, Captain Alexander started out to the ledge with a small group of picked men. They clambered over the rocky surface, where Alexander called them together for a brief word. He mentioned the failures and delays which were certain to occur, but he asked them all to be patient and persevering. In a few moments, he announced, work would be underway, which would not end until the completed tower was lighted, quote, whether it be 2 years or 10, unquote. Thus, on July 1st, 1855, the sound of hammer against chisel echoed through the early Sunday stillness, and the actual work on the stone tower began. But many long and weary months were to elapse before even the first block arrived at the ledge. The surface of the rock itself had to be carefully prepared to receive each of the 7 granite blocks required for the foundation. The first task was to cut a benchmark near the highest part of the rock, from which all subsequent levels were measured. Next, they made a level surface to provide room for the tools and an area for the men to stand on. Permanent iron shafts, about 20 feet high, were set in 8 of the holes in which the old lighthouse piling had been placed. The 9th, or central hole, was left open to form a cavity for the base circle. Later, the well for the drinking water was built from the central hole up through the middle of the tower. The iron piles were bound together by wrought iron frames, with a spider or capping placed at the top of the shafts. From each post, ropes were then crisscrossed, low enough for the men to grab when the waves broke over the ledge. The scaffolding also served as a derrick in laying the lower stages of masonry and as a bolt to secure the light to the rock formation. After the entire iron framework was painted a bright red, work was abandoned for the year. The men hoped that no wrecks would take place along the coast that winter, now that New England's bleakest season was at hand. They were doomed to disappointment. A severe storm hit Massachusetts Bay on January 19, 1857, throwing the bark New Empire against the Cohasset outer ledges. She later went ashore near Whitehead. When the gale had gone down a little that afternoon, Captain Alexander looked out to sea and was dismayed to find that his framework structure had disappeared. It was the one time when his spirit seemed to be broken. Having personally supervised the construction of every wrought iron section placed at the ledge, and knowing the great resistance of the combined superstructure, Captain Alexander was discouraged. "If tough wrought iron won't stand it," he said, "I have my fears about a stone tower." Something had happened during that storm, however, which gave renewed hope to Captain Alexander. The bark New Empire had actually struck the temporary tower and demolished the iron scaffolding at the ledge before she came ashore at Whitehead. Keeper Bennett had often feared that such an accident would destroy the former lighthouse, and now a wreck had occurred which snapped off the wrought iron framework erected where Bennett's tower had stood. Bound for Boston, the New Empire was loaded with cotton, and it was in this cargo that conclusive evidence was later discovered that the ship had crashed into the structure. The residents of Cohasset went out to Whitehead, and there made plans to reach the sailors in peril on the bark. Broken ice choked the area between the vessel and the shore, so that launching a boat was out of the question. Since the porridge-like ice formation was too weak to hold the weight of a man, the Cohasset people were faced with an unusual rescue problem. Peter Falcon now volunteered a plan, one of daring ingenuity. He was willing to try to walk out over the ice formation by stepping on two oblong life preservers made of rubber, the wide area under his feet preventing him from sinking through the ice. It was finally decided that he should make the effort. Falcon started out with the bulky preservers loosely tied to his feet so that he could kick them forward as he walked out over the ice floe. In this manner, he inched his way out to the New Empire, pulling a light line after him. After a strong hawser had been sent out, a skiff was used as a sled to ferry the men back to safety. All were saved, and Peter Falcon was considered the hero of the day. A few days later, at low tide, when an inspection of the bark was made, traces of red paint similar to the shade used at Minot's Ledge were discovered on the side of the vessel. Captain Alexander was notified at once. When questioned about the paint, most of the crew members of the New Empire said that they did not remember hitting any structure when the bark was pushed ashore by the tremendous seas. One sailor, however, who was standing quietly by, stepped forward and said that he had felt a great jar and crash that could not have been caused by the bark hitting the ledges alone. When the vessel was later hauled off and taken up to a Boston dry dock, fragments of the Minot's Ledge structure were actually found embedded in the cotton bales, and Captain Alexander was greatly encouraged. It had not been the force of the waves which had caused the second iron structure at Minot's Ledge to fall into the sea. Another vessel wrecked in the storm was the California. Piling up on Blackledge, the great ship had pounded heavily all through the night. 3 men on board took refuge on the ledge, which is about 400 yards off the shore. Since the porridge ice by this time seemed a trifle firmer, 2 boats were pushed across the uncertain ice toward Blackledge. Reaching the reef first, the men pushing the dory loaded the sailors into their craft and started back to shore, just as the other boat, a skiff, reached a point 50 feet from them. Suddenly, the dory began to settle through the ice so that the men could not move her. Those in the skiff passed one line ashore and another to the dory, and then all hands pulled the dory over to the skiff. By this time, the tide had started to go out, and the ice was beginning to break up. The horrified watchers on the shore began to lay loose planking across the ice and carried a long, heavy rope out to the 2 boats. Hundreds of willing hands then pulled the dory and the skiff to safety. The ice was so thick at this time around Minot's Ledge that the lightship, anchored a considerable distance from the rock itself, was completely surrounded by the floe. The winter of 1856 to 1857 was long remembered in New England for its severe cold weather. Boston Harbor was entirely frozen, thousands walking over the ice and visiting the East Boston shoreline, Thompson's Island, and the castle. Incidentally, Peter Falcon, the hero of the other rescue earlier in the day, later appeared at the scene of the California wreck and walked out over the ice to the ship. He rescued many gallons of gin from the vessel and brought them ashore to divide among his friends. But Falcon, starting for home with his container, broke it when he slipped on the ice. About a pint was left, and as he was undecided what to do with it, he drank the gin. It is said that Peter Falcon returned home late that night, but some of the others whose gallons did not break were less fortunate. It is quite possible to mistake the gleam of one lighthouse for the flashing beam of another, but perhaps the strangest error in that respect took place April 15th, 1857, when the bark Nueces from Galveston came into Boston Bay. A driving snowstorm obscured the lights until the captain finally picked up the flash from the lightship off Minot's Ledge. Mistaking the light for Thatcher's Island off Cape Ann, the captain set his course accordingly for Boston Light. This new direction brought him south of the Black Rocks, where he realized his mistake and anchored. The anchors failed to hold, and the bark kedged up on the shore near Green Hill. No lives were lost in this shipwreck. When good weather finally came in 1857, Captain Alexander visited the ledge again. He found that he had all of the work to do once more because of the crash of the new Empire. Not only had the wrought iron structure been smashed to pieces, but the upper surface of the rock itself had been damaged and broken. Another set of dowels had to be inserted into the cavities, and this time the piling was planned to reach a height of 25 feet, or the place where later the 12th course of masonry was laid. Month after month, the workmen hammered and chiseled at the upper surface of the ledge, at times working in 2 or 3 feet of water. Finally, Captain Alexander announced that the ledge was ready for the first granite block, and plans were made to send it out from the mainland. Here again difficulties were encountered, for there was only one strategic dock nearby where the stones could be unloaded, and the sailboat pounded its bilges against the ledge there, even though the keel rested in deep water. It is interesting to note that the vessel was unable to approach the landing with more than one of the 2-ton blocks aboard. On July 9, 1857, the first stone was laid at Minot's Ledge for the new lighthouse tower. General Totten had planned the form of every granite block in the structure, but because of the wreck of the new Empire and of the discovery of several blind seams in the ledge, the stones had to be altered. A plan soon was devised by which the foundation blocks, laid more than 2 feet under the surface of the lowest tide, could be cemented to the rock face of the ledge. Temporary cofferdams around small portions of the rock were thrown up by using 200 or 300 partially filled sandbags. Whatever water seeped through was quickly mopped up with giant sponges. The method adopted for securing a bed of mortar under the granite rocks and in the vertical joints was to spread a large piece of thin muslin on a platform at the ledge. A substantial layer of mortar was then applied, and the stone lowered down on the surface of the mortar. Next, the vertical joints of the stone were covered with mortar, the cloth folded up and smoothed along the joints, and the superfluous parts cut away. After remaining 5 or 10 minutes, the mortar began to set, and then the stone, with the mortared muslin adhering, was lowered into position. The mortar oozed through the cloth and formed a good adhesion with the rock surface below. The masonry was locked and dovetailed in such a way that the impact of each wave made the edifice stronger rather than weaker. As mentioned elsewhere, there were 7 stones in the lowest course of granite masonry. All the first level of granite blocks was laid underwater at dead low tide. In the second course, there were 29 stones, 12 of them partially underwater when placed into position. Angles and corners were 3 inches in length, and each course was 2 feet thick, with every stone weighing about 2 tons. The first 3 courses bore no resemblance to ordinary masonry. Most unusual curves and corners were carved out of the granite so that the blocks would fit the ledge. The foundation stones were secured to the rock by 2-inch galvanized wrought iron bolts, in addition to the 8 great piles, 25 feet high, which ran up from the original holes of the old tower. Each stone had to be cut to fit its neighbor above, below, and on each side. Strap iron between the courses kept the stones apart while the Portland cement was hardening. The total appropriation for the lighthouse had been $330,000, and a small surplus was realized when the actual construction was finished. Part of this money was intended to be used for the preparation of a volume about the building of the tower, complete with sketches, pictures, diagrams, and personal reminiscences. It was to have been the final gesture in the episode of the building of Minot's Light. But before Captain Alexander could collect the material in proper form, the Civil War intervened, and after the war he was assigned to duty on the Pacific coast so that he never returned to finish his book. Some idea of the plans he had made for the volume may be realized by the fact that he engaged the greatest American photographer of the day, James Wallace Black, to make the illustrations. Black visited the ledge at various times during the construction of the light, and many fine photographs were the result. We include 2 of his pictures in this volume. Although Alexander never returned to write his book, there are certain rough notes which he made that are of particular interest. The writer hopes that this volume, The Story of Minot's Light, may in some way take the place of Captain Alexander's book. The lowest stone was laid July 11, 1858. This ceremony was photographed by Mr. Black. The granite block and its companions were all lowered into place by a derrick attached to an iron mast set in the central hole. But let us have Captain Alexander tell the story. Quote, 1858. The machinery and rigging which completed the derrick had to be put on and taken off this mast every day that we landed for the purpose of laying masonry. It was of simple construction and arranged so as to float in the water, so that all we had to do after our tide's work was over was to cast the machinery loose from the mast and throw it with the attached rigging overboard. It could then be towed to the tender. We worked on the rock this year 208 hours. The foundation pit was finished this year, and the masonry of the tower was carried up to the 6th course." Unquote. In addition to Captain Alexander's short notes, we have the statements of several observers at the lighthouse. In 1896, Charles A. Lawrence, formerly with the Boston Globe, published a fine article on Minot's Light, in which he quotes an eyewitness who described a scene at the ledge. Quote, Captain Alexander had constructed 2 large, staunch rowboats, naming one Deucalion and the other Pyrrha, for he was a droll fellow, full of dry wit. The Deucalion was painted red, and this was more especially for his own use, while the Pyrrha, a green-painted craft, was to carry the men. We would watch the tide from the cove, and just as the ebb had reached the proper stage, we would start out with it. And at the moment a square yard of ledge was bare of water, out would jump a stonecutter and begin work. Soon another would follow, and as fast as they had elbow room, others still, until the rock would resemble a carcass covered with a flock of crows. The high-sounding names for the boats piqued the curiosity of the men not a little, until one of them finally inquired of Captain Alexander what on earth it meant. "Oh," replied he, "Deucalion was a giant who went through Greece of old, picking up stones and throwing them out of the way, and Pyrrha was his wife who ate them." With which mixed definition the questioner was forced to be content. Unquote. Captain Michael Neptune Brennick, a well-known Cohasset diver and boatman, worked as a lifeguard for the men at the ledge. He was stationed in a sloop alongside the rock to pick up workmen whom the waves might sweep from their scanty footing. Brennick's life-saving experiences went back to the wreck of the St. John, when he saved a woman from death in the surf. Seeing the body floating off the shore, he launched his lifeboat into the breakers and rescued what he believed to be a lifeless woman. She revived when brought ashore, however, and according to Brennick, quote, "married twice since," unquote. There was little for Captain Brennick to do at the ledge, as most of the workmen not only were cautious, but also were good swimmers. Nevertheless, there were many exciting moments. A man was posted to watch the incoming waves, and when he saw a high one rolling towards them, he shouted a cry of warning. The men using the drill merely held on when the waves swept across the ledge, and the strikers clutched a steel bolt driven in the rock for the purpose, or grasped the lifeline stretched across the framework. After the wave had drenched them, the men went back to their tasks, thoroughly wet, but safe. Captain Brennick said that pay was high for those times, $75 a month. He did earn his wages, however, as was evidenced by an event which took place during a day of heavy seas. On the particular summer day in question, Captain Reed, a master stonecutter, was so intent on his work that he did not hear the familiar warning signal, "Roller coming." Wearing a pair of craftsman trousers which came up to his armpits, an oil coat belted around his waist, and a Cape sou'wester, he was unprepared when the waves swept across the ledge. The surge caught him off guard, and it seemed but a second when he was 40 feet away and being carried against the inner Minot. Captain Brennick's story follows. Quote, "I was coiling up the jib halyards and heard the warning, but saw the man in the water at almost the same time. I dropped the rope and went over. He had sunk, and when I dove the first time, I missed him. The second time I got him, and as he was partially stunned, I had hard work. But some of the other men threw us a line. I bent the line around the man's waist, and they pulled him aboard. I swam to the boat, a small sloop, and climbed aboard. The new Minot's tower was almost an idol with me. I watched it rise, knew and handled every stone in it, and now I love to sit and watch it from my window on a stormy night when it shines like a huge star." Unquote. Another interesting character who worked on the new light was Captain John Cook, a competent rigger who made the model for the derrick which raised the stones in the tower. One day the captain played a joke on a green Vermont lad who had just arrived at the ledge. He asked the boy if he could swim, and upon receiving a negative reply, he informed the Vermonter that Captain Alexander might discharge him. By this subterfuge, he induced the boy to put on one of the old-fashioned hourglass life-preservers, and the poor lad worked many hours with the cumbersome preserver strapped to his back. Later in the day, the red boat, with Captain Alexander aboard, was seen making out for the light, so Captain Cook quickly thought up some excuse to have the boy remove the encumbrance. One of the laborers who worked on Government Island was Clark Cutting. His responsibility was to take the huge granite blocks to the cutters in the dray, drawn by his powerful oxen. It is said of Cutting that he never had to shift a stone twice. Captain Nicholas Tower had charge of the first vessels which brought finished stones to the rock. Other important men during the building of the light were Richard Bourne of Clinton, Massachusetts, Elijah Pratt and Howard Studley, who worked on the assembling of the granite work, and Wesley P. Dutton and George Reed, who supervised the selection of the stone. Also working on the new tower was William Noyes, a Southerner. He had an unusual interest in the building of the light, as he had labored on the construction of the former lighthouse. We have already mentioned his many visits to Keeper Isaac Dunham before the latter's resignation. Noyes was again hired to help construct the new stone tower. Because of some minor dispute, he later gave up his job and was seen no more around Cohasset. During the war between the North and South, a fine northern clipper ship, the Golden Fleece, with many Cohasset men aboard her, was overhauled and captured by the famous raider, Alabama. As the prisoners were taken aboard the southern ship, one of them glanced up the side, and there, standing against the poop rail in the uniform of a Confederate naval officer, was lighthouse builder William Noyes. The Cohasset men then believed Noyes a renegade and thought that he had deserted the North for the South. The writer, however, saw Noyes' signature in Keeper Dunham's logbook and wishes to correct this 80-year-old misunderstanding. When Noyes signed his name as a visitor to Minot's Light in 1850, 11 years before the war broke out, he put his home down as Key West, Florida, which was not exactly known as Yankee territory. With the granite structure built to a point above the ordinary reach of the tides, Captain Alexander made plans for the dedication of Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. He arranged to lay the cornerstone of the tower on the afternoon of October 2nd, 1858. There is still some confusion as to what actually happened. No one alive today can say which of the 1,079 granite blocks is the cornerstone, although many believe that it is the stone over the doorway with the date 1860 inscribed on it. At 10 o'clock on the morning of October 2nd, a party of about 400 people started from Boston on board the steamer Nantasket, bound for Minot's Ledge Light. Unfortunately, the sea was so rough that many passengers were quite ill by the time the boat passed Harding's Ledge, and the surf at Minot's was seen hitting high against the tower. The visit to the lighthouse was therefore abandoned. When Captain Alexander saw the Nantasket, he came out in the government boat and tried to get the steamer to follow him into Cohasset, but the Nantasket went back to Hull, where a telegram was dispatched ordering a special train to be sent to Hingham. The Nantasket continued to Hingham, where the group took the train for Cohasset, arriving after considerable delay around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A procession was formed, headed by the brigade band, and the march began from the railroad station over to Government Island, where a few tiers of granite blocks were assembled. The group was joined by several hundred residents of Cohasset, and the dedicatory services began. Mayor Frederick W. Lincoln of Boston introduced Captain Alexander to the audience. As the speeches were made near the blocks which would later be reassembled at the ledge, it was assumed that the orators were talking at the location of the lighthouse itself. Captain Alexander welcomed the distinguished visitors and went on to tell the tragic history of the ledge. Quote, "The history of this rock is no common one. It tells of shipwreck and disaster, of hairbreadth escapes, of suffering and woe. Standing like a watchful foe at the entrance to the harbor of Boston, to many of her sailors it has given the death blow. The advance of science has taught man to convert such foes into a watchtower that may ever stand, pointing upward to its own glorious light, sending far into the dim ocean's distance its rays of hope and warning to the mariner. A lighthouse of iron was erected here some years ago, whose fearful fate all may remember. Now again we are erecting a lighthouse here, but this time of granite piled on granite to build upon, the earth's substructure, granite engrafted and dovetailed into the foundation, and granite the whole. To give even more stability to this structure, each stone is riveted with galvanized iron bolts cemented into their sockets. So may it stand, that they that go down to the sea in ships may see this signal fire burning brightly to warn them from the countless rocks that echo with the rage that oft swells the bosom of old ocean. At the commencement of this work, we had nothing but money, no workmen, no shore establishment, no machinery, no boats, no organization. In 1 year, these all started into life. Sunday morning, the first day of July, 1855, just as the sun tipped the wings of the morning seagull as it took its flight over the wave, we struck our first blow on the Minot. The first year, 1855, we worked on it 130 hours. 1856, 157 hours. 1857, 130 hours and 21 minutes. 1858 to September 30th, 208 hours, making in all 625 hours, 21 minutes. At first, the men were nervous with a natural fear incident to their seemingly dangerous situation, but no accident ever befalling any of their number, and seeing every precaution taken for their safety, this fear was soon dispelled, and they worked as cheerily as on land. And you now see before you, gentlemen, the result of the labors of as fine a body of workmen as it has ever been my fortune to work with. Many reflections arise in our minds as we stand on the structure. Boston lights her streets with gas. The United States government, with protective care, lights our ocean highways not only for the benefit of the commerce of the Union, but for the commerce of the world. And it is a reflection worthy of this occasion to remember that it is our common government that has dotted our harbors with fortifications, bristling with cannon, that has built our navy yards and ships of war, that can furnish you 300,000 stand of arms in Massachusetts alone, giving you strength to bid defiance to the world. And lastly, it is our glorious Union that erects this structure." Unquote. Less than 3 years later, Captain Alexander was fighting for the preservation of that same glorious Union in the Civil War. The next speaker later figured prominently in the dedication of the Gettysburg battlefield. In fact, he spoke as the principal orator when Lincoln made his Gettysburg address. His name was Edward Everett. Mayor Lincoln introduced Mr. Everett, who gave an excellent talk under adverse circumstances. The sun had already set, and probably many were anxious to return home, but Edward Everett was equal to the occasion. He told them that he was glad to get back on land after the attempt to visit the lighthouse, and suggested that others shared his pleasure. The following is an excerpt from his speech. Quote, "I thought for a while, when you had us down in the outer harbor, that you had been learning a lesson from the sinking of the Atlantic telegraph. However greatly approving the enterprise, I must own myself too much of a landsman to have cooperated very efficiently in the undertaking, and I rather inferred from the grave looks and long faces of several of our friends that I was not alone in that disability. But we are once more on good firm land, and I think the most of us feel the better for the change of element. Well do I remember that dreadful night, when a furious storm swept along the coast of New England, by which houses were unroofed, steeples toppled down, and vessels driven on shore. In the course of that tremendous night, the lighthouse on Minot's Ledge disappeared. The ocean, driven in by the furious tempest, had dashed it in fragments on the rocks, and with it the 2 brave men who in that awful hour stood bravely at their posts. We have come now, sir, to repair the desolation of that hour." Unquote. Others who spoke that same day included Dr. Winslow Lewis, whose father was I.W.P. Lewis, lighthouse inspector for the Boston district. Dr. Lewis mentioned that his father had built more than 200 lighthouses up and down the coast, and it was he who first proposed the erection of a stone tower as the only feasible kind of structure for such an exposed location. Father Taylor, the well-known sailors' chaplain of Boston, offered a prayer for the safety of the light. An ode written by W. Wheeldon of Charlestown was sung by a male trio. The Honorable Jefferson Davis sent a message of congratulation, and President Comerford of Mexico attended in person. The Reverend E.M.P. Wells, distinguished as the first superintendent of the Farm and Trade School on Thompson's Island, gave the benediction at the close of the ceremony dedicating Minot's Light. As has been mentioned, the men worked on the ledge 208 hours in 1858. By the end of 1859, the 32nd course, 62 feet above low water, had been reached. 377 hours were needed for the task. The next year, on June 29, 1860, the final stone was laid and the granite work was complete. It had been 5 years, lacking 1 day, from the time the first workman with Captain Alexander had landed on the rock. The rest of the summer was spent putting in the lantern and lens, and early in August the cupola was fastened in place. The new lighthouse was actually finished by the middle of August 1860, and on Wednesday evening, August 22nd, the lantern was illuminated for the first time in history. Of course, it was merely a trial lighting and has no permanent historical significance. Visible from the shore, the lantern was covered on the side facing the ocean in order to prevent it from being seen by inward-bound vessels. 2 days later, an item appeared in the Boston Post describing the event. We quote from the pages of the Post. Quote, "The light was a very powerful one and could have been seen from a great distance. By the side of it, the lights on the lightship seemed like farthing candles. The work has been prosecuted to completion by Captain Alexander of the Engineers Corps, the superintendent, to whom great credit is due." Unquote. Captain Barton S. Alexander now notified the government that the lighthouse was ready. On August 23rd, a bulletin was issued to mariners. The substance of the announcement follows. Quote, "Notice to mariners. Information has been received at this office from Captain B.S. Alexander, Corps of Engineers, of the completion of the lighthouse on the outer Minot's Ledge, one of the Cohasset rocks. The tower is of a dark gray granite, 30 feet in diameter at the base, 89 feet 7 inches high above mean low water. It is surmounted by a bronze lantern, 22 feet 7 inches high, making the total height of the structure above mean low water 112 feet 2 inches. The illuminating apparatus is catadioptric of the second order of the system of Fresnel and will show a fixed white light. The focal plane is 84 feet above the mean high water, and the light should be visible at mean high water from a point 15 feet above the surface of the sea at a distance of 15 nautical miles. The light will be exhibited for the first time from sunset to sunrise on the 15th day of November, 1860, and every night thereafter. By authority of the Act of Congress, approved September 28, 1856, the light at Scituate will be extinguished on the exhibition of the Minot's Ledge light, and the light vessel now stationed at Minot's Ledge will be withdrawn and discontinued at the same time. The new light bears from Boston Lighthouse east-southeast, 1/2 south, distant about 9 miles. It is latitude 42 degrees 16 minutes 9 seconds north, longitude 70 degrees 5 minutes 14 seconds east from Greenwich. Alexander's notes. Here is a technical summary of the construction of Minot's Light, written by Captain Alexander. The first blow struck on the ledge Sunday morning at sunrise, July 1st, 1855. Hours worked on ledge in excavating foundation pit during 1855, 130 hours. Hours worked on ledge in excavating foundation pit during 1856, 157 hours. Hours worked on ledge in excavating for laying 4 stone during 1857, 130 hours, 21 minutes. Hours worked on ledge in excavating pit and in laying 6 course during 1858, 208 hours. Hours worked on ledge in laying 26 courses of stone during 1859, 377 hours. 1,102 hours, 21 minutes total. Number of tons of rough stone, 3,514. Number of tons of hammered stone, 2,367. Number of stones in lighthouse, 1,079. The first stone was laid July 9th, 1857. The lowest stone was laid July 11th, 1858. Whole height from bottom of lowest stone to top of pinnacle, 114 feet 1 inch. Height of focal plane above lowest point, 96 feet 1 inch. Height of focal plane above mean high water, 84 feet 7 inches. Diameter of third or first full course, 30 feet. Diameter of top of 22nd course, solid part, 23 feet 6 inches. Observations made at Boston Lighthouse from June 7th to October 27th, 1847 furnish the following results. Rise of highest tide, 14 feet 7 inches. Mean rise and fall of tides, 9 feet 4 inches. Mean rise and fall of spring tides, 10 feet 8 inches. Mean rise and fall of neap tides, 8 feet 3 inches. The Lighthouse of Minot's Ledge by S. C. Briggs. 3 leagues from the shore in Boston Bay, on a rocky, ragged ledge, there rises, grim and gaunt and gray, the lighthouse of Minot's Ledge. And the great Atlantic's rolling tide breaks over it, foaming high, as it sends a warning far and wide, o'er sand and sea and sky. Ere that tower was raised in the olden days, another lighthouse stood, propped on the rock upon iron stays, and the keepers deemed it good. Both wanderers they, from a distant strand, far over the alien seas, a fair-haired son of the fatherland, and a dark-eyed Portuguese. But there came a day when a storm befell that baffled human guile, and all day long the powers of hell beat on that doomed pile. And all day long the folk on the beach gazed on the awful sight, and moaned that no mortal help could reach, and shuddered to think of night. Night fell, and the storm raged on apace, but the lamp was lighted true, and the winds and the waters ran their race as the tide rolled thundering through. Ah, the shocks were hard, and the strain was long, and the swaying stanchions broke. But the lamp shone on, now dim, now strong, for the foam rose up like smoke. Then the great weird fog bell, struck by the sea, rang out its own death knell, and tolled for the souls that escaped and were free when their faithless dwelling fell. Then the lamp went out in that awful rout, and the bell tolled on through the night. One corpse was washed on the shore at morn, one never came to light. Their alien names are forgotten quite by an English-speaking race, but the fame of their gallant watch that night still clings to their ancient place, and they talk in the great strong tower on the strand, when the storm wind rides on the seas, of that fair-haired boy of the fatherland and the dark-haired Portuguese. End of The Granite Tower. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 6 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Keepers of the New Beacon. With the completion of the world's most hazardous stone lighthouse, the government now began its search for a suitable keeper. Joshua Wilder was chosen for this important post late in the fall. Very little is known of his background. The custom of having 2 men to assist the head keeper was continued, and A.W. Williams and William S. Taylor were chosen first and second assistants, respectively. The men landed at the ledge on November 13, 1860, in time to prepare the light for its inaugural flash 2 nights later. November 15th dawned, pleasant and free from high winds. The keepers labored throughout the day in order to have everything in readiness for the important evening ahead. They knew that thousands of people would be watching the tower as soon as the sun began to set, and that the moment they lighted the beacon at Minot's Ledge, the news would be quickly telegraphed to the farthest corners of the United States, since the event was of interest to the entire country. As the last glow of the setting sun was fading in the western sky, Keeper Joshua Wilder stepped into the lantern room high in the tower of Minot's Light and looked out over the darkening landscape. The sight which met his eyes was thrilling and extremely gratifying. Scores of bonfires were burning along the south shore to celebrate the first lighting of the new Granite Tower. It almost seemed as if the Indians, around many campfires, were celebrating the final conquest of Hobbamock, the red man's evil spirit. A moment later, the first beam from the new tower flashed through the dusk. The goal of many strenuous days, months, and years of constant struggle had finally been achieved. Then, in answer to the bright, steady beam from the high stone tower out in the sea, Roman candles and skyrockets shot up into the sky from various points along the Cohasset and Scituate shoreline. Keeper Wilder was happy to see that people ashore were doing their part to honor the triumph of man over the destructive forces of the ocean. Minot's beacon again flashed its friendly warning to the ships of all nations entering Boston Bay, but this time the lighthouse was to stand throughout the years. The people of Scituate realized that the successful completion of Minot's Light signified the death knell of the old lighthouse at Cedar Point in that town. Indeed, the government's decree had specifically stated that Scituate Light was to be extinguished forever, and the lightship near Minot's Ledge to be withdrawn as soon as Minot's great stone tower flashed for the first time. An attempt had been made to keep the old lighthouse active by changing its characteristic to a red flash, but the plan was finally abandoned. Keeper Thomas Richardson, who had developed a sentimental attachment for the Scituate beacon, wondered whether he could think of some act appropriate to the significance of the occasion. He recalled the incident that had taken place at the lighthouse during the War of 1812. The 2 Bates girls, Rebecca and Abigail, were alone at the light when they sighted a troop of British soldiers ready to disembark from an English man-of-war anchored in Scituate Harbor. The girls hid behind a bluff near the lighthouse, one playing the fife, the other sounding the bugle. When the stirring strains of the martial music reached the ears of the British soldiers, they feared that a company was forming for battle, so the frigate hoisted anchor and sailed out of the harbor. Thinking of the everlasting association of the 2 girls' names with Scituate Light, Keeper Richardson tried to devise a plan which might connect his son's name with the history of the beacon. It was the night of November 14th, and Minot's Light would flash out its signal the following night. Toward midnight, Richardson made up his mind that Scituate Light should be put out in some unusual fashion the next morning, as it would never be lighted again if Minot's flash was successful. It would be a spectacular culmination to the history of Scituate Light to let his 10-year-old son, Edward, forever extinguish the beam in the lighthouse tower. Half an hour before dawn, on the morning of November 15th, Keeper Richardson awakened his son and revealed his plan. Hardly realizing what it was all about, the lad dressed sleepily and followed his father up into the tower. as the first red streaks of dawn appeared in the eastern sky, the lad looked out to sea at Minot's Ledge Light, the successful rival of the old Scituate beacon. A minute later, Edward Richardson, son of the keeper of Scituate Lighthouse at Cedar Point, put out forever the beam which had guided Scituate sailors and fishermen into the harbor since 1811. That same night, Edward Richardson and his father silently watched Minot's powerful beam flashing what Longfellow called its friendly fire. The people of Cohasset were not so morose as the Richardson family, however. The Boston papers recorded the activity along the shore. Quote, "The occasion was made one of some demonstration on the part of joyful inhabitants of the South Shore. A large and distinguished company went down from Boston to celebrate the event." Unquote. A small group of appreciative residents of Cohasset went to the home of Captain Barton Alexander, engineer in charge of the construction of Minot's Light, to congratulate him on the successful completion of his undertaking. After an informal reception, the guests departed. Although the country was then at peace, less than 8 months later, Alexander was destined to be in the thick of the fighting at Bull Run. A friend from South Hingham visited Joshua Wilder at Minot's Light in July 1861. In his letter to the local paper, he mentions his climb up the long ladder and his inspection of the powerful fixed lens in the lantern room. "Having recently enjoyed visiting old friend Joshua, I am going to furnish you with a description of the light." The Hingham gentleman then goes on to give a layman's fine account of the new beacon off the Cohasset shore. With less than a year of service, Joshua Wilder resigned on August 16, 1861. No reason has come down through the years to account for this rather abrupt termination of Wilder's activity. James J. Tower, a member of the prominent Cohasset family by that name, became the second keeper of the new lighthouse. With him, he brought out to the beacon Thomas Bates, who was later to distinguish himself as a lifesaver at Boston Light. Member of another important Cohasset family, Assistant Keeper Bates made a name for himself one day while at the Rock. On the afternoon in question, the head keeper was rowing out to the lighthouse when, in some inexplicable way, the craft tipped over and he was thrown into the water. From the tower high above, Thomas Bates saw the accident. Although he was alone at the light, the assistant keeper took a desperate chance and won. Working feverishly, he let go the blocks holding the lifeboat to the davits 80 feet above the sea, jumped into the boat, and let the cables run through. The boat, approaching the water at express speed, smashed into the sea so that the hooks disengaged themselves. Bates was now able to row over and save the life of head keeper Tower. It is easy to see what a disaster this incident could have become. If the line had tangled or jammed, it might have meant the death of both men. It was perhaps because of this noteworthy deed that on July 12, 1864, Assistant Keeper Bates was promoted to the position of head keeper at Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse in America. The public had shown a marked interest in Minot's Light from the beginning, but around 1862 they began to visit the beacon in substantial numbers. Hundreds of people sailed out to see the light. A group of soldiers from Fort Warren made the long trip to the ledge on August 22, 1864, and the next year, Dr. Joel Severns, who was a surgeon at the fort while Alexander Hamilton Stevens was a prisoner there, visited Minot's Ledge Light. Major Severns is mentioned many times in the diary which Confederate Vice President Stevens kept while the Georgian was a political prisoner at the Northern Bastille. Sweeping down from the northeast, a wind-driven snowstorm lashed the Massachusetts coast on March 1, 1868. The next morning, when Keeper Tower looked out over the ocean, he saw the schooner Nathaniel G. Clark anchored near the light and noticed that her cables were dragging. A few hours later, the Clark had drifted by the West Willies and crashed against the ledge inside the Hazards. Of the 6 crew members, only 2 were able to cling to the top gallant forecastle, an old sailor and a boy. The sailor was drowned in trying to reach the shore, but the lad was later rescued. The vessel went to pieces before night fell. Levi L. Creed became the keeper of Minot's Ledge Light upon the resignation of Keeper Tower in 1874. One day, the new inspector from the 2nd District in Boston visited the beacon on Minot's Rock. After a thorough examination of the lighthouse, he signed the visitor's registry book. As Keeper Creed watched the inspector climb down the ladder and step into the waiting tender, he could not possibly foresee that in 1898, as Commodore of a great American fleet, that same lighthouse inspector would defeat the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. The name of the inspector was George Dewey. Levi Creed resigned in 1881, and his assistant, Frank F. Martin, was appointed keeper of Minot's Light. His helpers were Frank W. Thomas, Lester G. Willett, and Albert H. Burdick. Others who worked under Creed at the light were Joseph E. Frates and Joseph Jason, Jr. On August 29, 1886, a thick sea fog swept in from the east, completely blanketing the vicinity of the tower. Keeper Martin and his men took turns sounding the huge fog bell, the clapper hitting at regular periods. Nevertheless, a vessel entering Boston Harbor completely lost its bearings, sailing within a mile of the lighthouse. She was the bark Joseph A. Ropes from Zanzibar, Africa. The vessel finally crashed on a rock near the sea ledges, but as the ocean was comparatively calm, no serious damage was sustained. Hauled off a few days later, she was able to proceed to Boston. 5 years later, the Joseph A. Ropes was wrecked off the coast of Madagascar. After completing 25 years of service in 1887, Keeper Frank F. Martin resigned from the Lighthouse Department to enter business in Boston. Milton Herbert Reamy assumed the position of head keeper on January 3, 1887. His was the longest career at the famous Rock. Beginning in the service as assistant keeper at Duxbury Pier Light in 1878, Reamy became head keeper at the Granite in 1880. Now, at the age of 35, he was appointed to take charge of America's most dangerous beacon, Minot's Ledge Lighthouse. Keeper Reamy remembered the great gale of '88 more vividly than any of the other storms during his period of service. Even the 1898 Portland storm did not wreak so much havoc in the immediate vicinity of the lighthouse. Joseph E. Frates, Keeper Reamy's assistant, told him that one particular wave, which struck the tower on Sunday, November 25, 1888, made his hair actually stand on end. The tower remained firm, however, for Captain Alexander had builded well. The wave caused a strong vibration at the time, but Keeper Reamy declared that nothing but an earthquake would ever shake down the lighthouse. All during Tuesday morning, November 27th, wreckage drifted by the Rock, and Keeper Reamy kept watching the flotsam being swept along by the tide. The first object he was able to identify was a steamer's topmast, which was painted black 6 feet down from the peak. Cabin steps were next sighted, then panelwork, casks, boxes, life preservers, and broken fragments of the superstructure. All of the articles seemed to be floating from the vicinity of Jason's ledge. Keeper Reamy feared that the steamer Allentown, with 18 on board, had gone down after striking the dangerous reef a mile to the northeast of the lighthouse. He was later asked if he had heard a whistle that fateful night when the Allentown was lost. "I did not," he answered, "and it would have been impossible to hear a whistle if it had been within 10 feet of the light, owing to the tremendous roar of the waves as they dashed over the light." The writer has italicized, for it is the first recorded testimony to the effect that the sea actually went over the top of the 114-foot structure. "How did the light stand it, Captain?" a reporter for the Boston Globe asked him when he came ashore later. Quote, "She stood it well. There was some vibration, and it leaked under the windows. The chimney that we used on the lamp Sunday night was cracked, and that was all the damage I know of," unquote. 15 ships were wrecked between Scituate Harbor and Boston in that 1888 hurricane. Life preservers and marked lifeboats soon came ashore in Cohasset to prove that the Allentown actually had foundered near Minot's Light, and the Edward H. Norton went ashore on the first cliff, Scituate, with the loss of all 15 of her crew. The schooner Sassonawa drifted by Minot's Light and came ashore on Pleasant Beach after having snapped her anchor chains in Gloucester Harbor. High and dry, the craft remained a picturesque landmark for many years. When Keeper Remy first went out to Minot's Light in 1887, he asked that a boat keeper be appointed to work the rock. His request was granted, in that he was allowed to have a third assistant keeper. Thus, Minot's Light had 4 keepers until after the turn of the century. The first man who became third assistant keeper at Minot's was George L. Lyons, who later served as head keeper of Egg Rock Light off Nahant. In February 1893, Gustave Courbet made a trip out to Minot's Light in the Geranium, the lighthouse tender. When the boat arrived in the vicinity of the ledge, he saw that Keeper Remy had chopped away the ice from the top rungs of the bronze ladder leading from the water to the first landing. The Geranium anchored at the buoy, and Courbet had his first close view of the 114-foot edifice. He tells us that the tower was weather-streaked, and its base, up to the high-water mark, was covered with a greenish-black ooze. Since the sea was rough, the keepers lowered the loop of rope for the visitor. Cautiously, he placed 1 foot through the loop, and up he went. When Courbet reached the landing, the keeper, who pulled him aboard, appeared more relieved than the visitor that he had made a safe journey through the air. As Courbet stood on the storeroom landing, he was shown the deep well in the center and was told that it not only contained the water supply, but also acted as a warning in the remote possibility of a serious crack in the lower part of the tower, as the water would run out if a fissure developed. Gustave Courbet stayed at the tower for several days as the guest of the keeper, Milton Remy. He found the most enjoyable part of the tower to be the watchroom, where the men used to spend their leisure. Here the keepers were accustomed to sit when they were not busy during the day, and it was from the watchtower that they kept track of the glow of the lantern room. Because of the cold, sticky dampness, which was the result of the sweating of the great tower in the winter, Courbet discovered that the men were obliged to sleep with most of their clothes on. Dressing was thus very simple in the winter, with a minimum of garments to don. A storm came up when Gustave Courbet was a guest at the tower. He describes it as follows, quote, "I shall never forget my sensation when the first heavy sea struck the tower during my stay. I was sitting with the assistant keeper in the watchroom. Both of us were reading. At the head of 3 of the staircases in the tower are heavy iron doors. Suddenly there was a clangorous shock, as if these ponderous doors had crashed 2 in unison, and a moment later all the demons of the storm seemed to be let loose around the top of the tower. Such was the confused roar of wind and water above and about us, the only rhythmic sound being the dismal striking of the fog bell," unquote. Courbet was fascinated by the wildness of the scene and often went out on the deck of the lighthouse in the middle of the night to appreciate the indescribable grandeur of the mighty ocean. Quote, One night, after a gray, threatening day, as I was standing upon the parapet, I heard a sudden rush of wind, and through the halo that surrounded the lantern there scurried what seemed to be myriads of white, ghost-like birds, without a twitter or even the rustle of a feather, driven before the storm, and vanishing into the darkness as suddenly as they had emerged from it. Cold, feathery flakes blown into my face told me that this weird effect was produced by a snow squall whirling around the tower. Another night, as I came out on the parapet, I was startled to find the sky ribbed with black lines that formed the framework of a huge dome centering directly above the tower. A fog had closed in, and against it were projected the vastly elongated shadows of the iron supports that run from the lantern deck to the dome above it, while the light, as it was thrown upon the fog by the lens, filled in the spaces with a dun glare that was unearthly in its effect." Unquote. Gustave Courbet was forced to stay at the tower for some time after his work was finished, as the storm lasted several days. We are sure, however, that he never forgot his vivid experiences as a visitor at Minot's Light. Keeper Milton Reamy was notified in 1894 that there would be a new lantern of the flashing type installed at the tower sometime that spring. Workmen arrived in April, and for several days were busy removing the old lamp and adjusting the new revolving lens and lighting apparatus. By May 1st, all was in readiness for the flashing beacon. At that time, the government decided to give each lighthouse a definite numerical flash, one which could be identified without trouble by sailors out on the ocean. Although the custom was never carried out except in a few scattered cases, Minot's Light has to this day maintained its 143 flash. The familiar dash, 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 dash requires 30 seconds to complete. Lovers along the shore were quick to detect that the characteristic of Minot's new light had the same numerical count as the term of endearment, "I love you." There are very few people today definitely acquainted with Minot's Light who do not understand the significance of its characteristic flash, because it is known up and down the coast as the Lover's Light. Saturday afternoon, November 26, 1898, was clear and calm. Later that night, the wind came up and it started to snow. Back in Boston, Captain Horace H. Blanchard sailed his side-wheeler Portland out of the harbor with 175 persons on board. The storm grew worse, and the Portland never reached a safe harbor. All of the crew and passengers were lost. Although many theories have been advanced, it is probable that the tragic story of the Portland will never be known. How close it came to Minot's Light on its fateful trip is mere conjecture, but Keeper Reamy did not pay any unusual attention to the gale. As it failed to reach its greatest intensity until late evening, he considered it an average northeaster. But in the morning, when he focused his telescope on the shore and saw many wrecks along the beach, he realized that the gale must have been one of terrific velocity. Sometime during that wild night, the Boston pilot boat Columbia, unable to keep off the shore, was battered and blown in past the lighthouse. Not a man of the crew escaped alive, and the pilot boat was flung high and dry on the beach at Scituate. Scores of other boats were wrecked in this storm, which will always be remembered as the Portland Gale. Octavius Reamy of Cohasset succeeded his father as keeper of Minot's Light in 1915, and it may be of interest to know that the combined services of the two men at the ledge total about half a century. It was not the first time that both father and son served there. In 1850, the reader may recall, Isaac Dunham and his son Isaac A. Dunham were on duty at the old tower. Octavius Reamy's first official connection with Minot's Light was in 1897, when he was known as Additional Keeper. For a few weeks, he took the place of his father, who went to the Nashville Exposition as the representative of the lighthouse service. The assistant keeper was then Winfield Creed, the son of former keeper Levi L. Creed. Sometime later, Winfield Creed became keeper of the Spectacle Island Range Lights in Boston Harbor. After a few years on shore, Octavius Remy re-entered the lighthouse service, and in 1915 succeeded his father, as we have stated. 2 years later, war with Germany was declared, and Remy watched the American destroyers steaming out of Boston Harbor on their way to the war zone. It was not long before the naval reservists were sent to Minot's Light for training, and Remy soon became accustomed to the lads working at the various duties at the Great Stone Tower. The winter of 1918 was one of the coldest ever experienced along the coast. Ice formed at the foot of the tower until it bulged out almost 3 feet at the base of the ladder. The shelf of ice was so substantial that the boys climbed down the rungs of the ladder and stood on the solid mass of ice extending out over the water. It was the only time in Keeper Remy's memory, nor does he recall any similar occasion that was ever mentioned by his father, when the ice was frozen over all the way from Minot's Light to Point Allerton, 6 miles distant. The next day, a northeast gale sprang up, and the battle of wind and water against ice was an interesting match to watch. At first, the gale did not appear to make an impression on the flat, unbroken surface of the ice, the waves apparently vanishing the moment they reached the ice pack. Gradually, however, the edges of the floe began to crack and crumple, and in an hour the gale had triumphed, with the broken ice cakes tossing and pushing toward the rocky shore. It was a spectacle which Remy believed has rarely been witnessed from the rock. Perhaps the most thrilling episode in Remy's career at the lighthouse was in November 1915, his first year at Minot's. The day before Thanksgiving, a gale had swept the coast, but by morning the storm had abated sufficiently to allow a young Cohasset man, George F. Newton, Jr., to attempt to make a picture of the tower with the sea hitting against it. He had built a fast speedboat and was the owner of a fine Graflex camera. For some time he had been waiting for the ideal arrangement of wind, storm, and tide, and Thanksgiving 1915 presented all elements in perfect combination. Let us hear from George Newton himself. Quote, "As it had been in my mind for some time to try to photograph the surf on Minot's, I decided that on Thanksgiving in 1915 to give it a try, if I could navigate near enough to the light in safety. I invited Percy Hendry to go along, and he accepted. We succeeded in reaching a favorable point where I let the engine idle to enable me to take the photographs. Our time was cut short, and the tide and wind were carrying the boat into a dangerous position. The engine stalled, and efforts to start it at once were fruitless, so we anchored. Although the line may have been too short, the boat did not stand a chance because a breaking wall of water, 12 to 15 feet high, crashed on the boat. The sea took me and everything with it, breaking the anchor line and filling the boat." Unquote. High in the tower, Keeper Remy was watching the 2 young men, and when the waves struck the craft, he raised the signal for the life-saving boat to come to the rescue. A powerful swimmer, Newton made his way back to the speedboat, and the first thing that he saw was his camera floating in the water in the boat. The craft slowly drifted by the light and then reached a point off the East Shag Rocks, located in less tempestuous waters. Throwing over their remaining anchor, they were grateful when it held, just in time to prevent the crashing of the boat against the ledge 1/2 mile from Minot's Light. An hour later, the life-saving boat appeared, and the young men were rescued. One of the pictures taken that thrilling day turned out to be an excellent shot, and the writer has included it in this volume. One afternoon, a group of sightseers sailed out to the lighthouse, which they were accustomed to see flash its vigilant warning. Keeper Remy, standing at the doorway, invited them into the tower. As was the custom, the ladies were harnessed into the old-fashioned Longfellow's chair and then hauled up the side of the 114-foot edifice and deposited in the doorway of the first landing. One lady in particular seemed quite grim during the journey up against the outside of the tall granite structure, but she arrived at the entrance without any comment. She did not mention that she had heart trouble until later, when the party was ready to descend to the boat. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Keeper Remy tied her as safely as possible before he swung her out over the waves. Suddenly, she seemed to grow pale and sway in the chair, which was lowered at a great speed so that she would only be in the air a short time. She reached the boat safely and sat quietly while the other members of the group were lowered from the tower. Finally, when all were aboard, the skipper sailed away. The next time he visited the lighthouse, he informed Keeper Remy that the lady suffering from heart trouble had fainted dead away as the boat left the light. Keeper Remy left us to imagine what might have happened had she fainted on the way down in the chair. One day, when a strong offshore wind was blowing toward the lighthouse, Keeper Remy saw a rowboat approaching from Scituate. Aided by a 10-mile wind, the craft was making very good progress, but Remy could tell that the man at the oars was a landlubber. A lady was sitting confidently in the stern, and neither she nor her companion realized the danger of the situation. Finally, they reached the vicinity of the lighthouse and started to turn around for the journey homeward. Rowing with the same effort he had used on his way out to the light, the landlubber failed to make any headway in the wind and was slowly drifting out to sea. He then rowed more furiously than ever, but was barely able to hold his own. Observing that the keeper had noted his predicament, he signaled for help. Remy notified the Coast Guard crew, who sailed out and rescued the badly frightened couple a quarter of a mile the other side of Minot's Ledge Light. Around the year 1922, Miss Alina G. Emerson, a Boston music teacher, wrote a song about Minot's Light and dedicated it to Miss Muriel Crocker. Her friends were so impressed with the song that they made arrangements for Miss Emerson to visit the lighthouse. After climbing to the top of the light, she sang her own composition as she stood on the upper turret of the tower. All through the night, staunch Minot's light flashes its signal over the sea. To sailors it speaks of rocks and shoals, that ominous 143. But lovers know well that those flashes tell the old, old story forever new. Over and over, year after year, they read them, I love you. A few months after the song was written, a masquerade ball was held at Cohasset. Linehan Crocker was the outstanding attraction at the ball in his unique costume, which was designed by Mrs. Mary Page. Dressed as the beacon at Minot's, he had connected a battery in his vest pocket to a light which flashed out the well-known 143. Back at the light, Keeper Remy was preparing for the coming cold weather. Often, when he was swinging up onto the ladder from a boat, he had been plunged into the water up to his waist, sometimes in the middle of winter. But it was all part of the game, and he had no complaints. Keeper Remy, when asked about the crack under the cornice of the Granite Tower, which the writer had noticed some years before, said that it had been there as long as he himself could remember. The location of the fissure is the southeast side of the upper turret. The writer has heard that the crack occurred when the lantern was installed. The dimensions of the break were greatly exaggerated several years ago, and the huge stone tower depicted as about to crumble into the sea. The surf has caused the immense granite pile to tremble many times, of course. Once such a tremor was caused by the waves that the pendulum in the clock stopped. Keeper Remy has affirmed that the surf has broken over the top of Minot's Light probably 10,000 times in the 80 years' existence of the second structure. Head keeper Octavius H. Remy left Minot's Light forever on May 11, 1924, when he was transferred to the quieter and more spacious station at Graves Ledge. Keeper Remy of Graveslight retired from the lighthouse service in September 1939. After having served as assistant at the ledge from September 1922, Per S. Tornberg was appointed the new keeper of Minot's Light. One day in the winter, when ice formed on the lower part of the ladder, Tornberg noticed that the heavy weight of the ice broke the ladder right off. Later, he thought he saw part of the ladder sticking up above the surface, so he launched the boat. He let the craft down until it hit the sea, then loosened the stern falls. While the bow falls were still attached, he heard a roaring sea coming for him from behind the tower. It was probably similar to the waves which the workmen experienced when they were building the lighthouse 75 years before. Although he made a desperate effort to hitch the bow falls, Tornberg could not escape the waves. The sea simply picked him up and pushed the keeper down against the ledge. Incidentally, he still held a cigarette firmly clenched between his lips, even though he lost his cap and part of his clothing. Tornberg was able to fight his way back to safety at the tower. Upon another occasion when he was ashore, Tornberg went over to the Glades to arrange for the return trip to the lighthouse, but he found the dory, which was always used, cracked open by the cold and unfit for service. He obtained the use of a smaller boat into which he threw his supplies. His friend, Manuel Figueiredo, helped him down to the beach with the tender, and they pushed off for the light. An ice floe 200 yards off the shore formed a difficult obstacle to their progress, but after laboriously pushing and pulling their craft through the hard ice, they reached the outer edge of the ice pack. The men now started rowing across the open sea for the lighthouse. Suddenly, they noticed the tender leaking badly. Evidently, in crossing the ice floe, they had opened up a crack through which the water was now flowing. Figueiredo started bailing frantically, but as if to make matters worse, a strong northwest wind sprang up. The keeper maneuvered the boat to within 200 yards of the light, but did not have the power to reach the beacon. "I did not have strength enough to hold the boat against the wind," Tornberg remarked later. The wind freshened, and the craft was buffeted by the choppy waves. Keepers Otis E. Walsh and Anthony K. Souza perceived the perilous situation of their head keeper and his friend and telephoned the Coast Guard. By this time, the two men had been carried in their leaking boat almost to Scituate Point, where they saw the Coast Guard starting to row out after them in the large surf dory. But the 6 men in the dory became hopelessly bogged in the heavy, drifting pack ice and gave up their attempt to reach the 2 men in the tender. Returning to the Scituate Coast Guard station, they tried again in a different style boat, which they pushed through the ice floe. The water by this time had reached within 2 inches of the gunwales, and any sideways movement would have resulted in the sinking of the boat. Fortunately, however, the 2 men were saved. At the failure of the first attempt to reach the men, word had been sent out over the shortwave radio that the Coast Guard boat could not break through, and the tender from Boston was dispatched, as well as the rescue boat from Hull. Both boats arrived in time to see the second Coast Guard craft from Scituate make the rescue. Tornberg and Figueiredo were taken to Scituate and put to bed, but they were none the worse for their narrow escape from death. In the early spring of 1936, Captain Wilbur Bryant of the Hilda E. took a group from the Massachusetts Historical League out to Minot's Ledge to hold a memorial service for the 2 keepers drowned 85 years before. The Reverend R.E. Gilmore gave a fine talk and prayer while all stood in the lantern room of the tower. The minister had recently arrived from the Middle West, and his baptism in the Atlantic was a trip to the great granite beacon off Cohasset. Keeper Tornberg and Assistant Keeper Walsh both spoke briefly at this time, and Miss Daisy Whitman, the president of the League, paid high tribute to the brave lighthouse keepers. Per S. Tornberg was transferred from the Minot's Light Station to Annisquam Light on the North Shore in July 1936. The writer has interviewed him several times at his new station and has found him happy and industrious at his shore location. He was succeeded at Minot's Ledge by keeper George H. Fitzpatrick. Keeper George H. Fitzpatrick was assistant keeper at Minot's Light from August 15, 1924, until January 1st, 1927, when he was transferred to the Graves Light Station. He remained at Graves Light for over 9 years, returning to Minot's Ledge Light as head keeper in the summer of 1936. One of the pleasant surprises visitors to the watchroom enjoyed was the little yellow canary belonging to assistant keeper Sousa. The bird's happy notes gave an air of cheerfulness in the atmosphere of isolation at the lonely lighthouse. On sunny days, when the cage was hung outside on the parapet, the canary burst rapturously into song. During the late afternoon of August 26, 1938, Keeper Fitzpatrick was preparing to light the gas mantle for the evening when he observed a schooner near the beacon. The boat was southeast of the light, and the keeper paid particular attention to it, as it was the Lyria, an auxiliary schooner partly owned by his predecessor at the lighthouse, Per S. Tornberg. Suddenly there was a flash on board the 68-foot craft, and a dull glow lighted up the sky. Fire, one of man's worst enemies at sea, had broken out on the vessel. Keeper Fitzpatrick telephoned the Coast Guard at once, and a boat was dispatched to the scene. Before it could reach the location, however, Captain Ralph McDonough of the Boston to New York line had seen the fire and was approaching the schooner. Attracted by the glow in the sky, Captain McDonough ordered full speed ahead, and the New York soon reached the schooner. The 3 persons on board the Lyria were rescued from their skiff by the crew of the New York. A few hours later, the survivors were transferred to the Sandwich Coast Guard Station picket boat at the entrance to the Cape Cod Canal. On July 1, 1940, the United States Coast Guard assumed control of all government lighthouses. The Minot's Ledge Light, therefore, came under the supervision of Captain Sumner H. Cobbett, in charge of the First Cliff Coast Guard Station in Scituate, and the 2 branches of the service are now working in harmony for the most efficient results. After having mentioned so many incidents about the area near Minot's Ledge, it would be fitting to explain why Minot's Rock is so called. Unfortunately, there is no definite source which can be cited to explain the naming of the ledge. However, it is believed that George Minot, who owned Tea Wharf in Boston in 1754, is the man for whom the rock is named. The assumption is that one of Minot's ships was wrecked on the ledge, which now bears his name. End of Keepers of the New Beacon. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 7 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Stories and Legends. Every important location up and down this romantic coastline has its legends and ghost stories, and Minot's Ledge Light is no exception. Some of the stories which are included here may be more than mere legends, but because of the difficulty of placing time and persons, they cannot receive the stamp of absolute fact. The first story is about the work at the tower. Since cleaning the lens and the lamps is an integral part of the job at a lighthouse, anything out of the ordinary about this duty is likely to attract attention. One morning, a short time after the Civil War, the head keeper at Minot's Light suddenly realized that something strange had happened. The lamp and the lens had been brightly polished that morning, although the assistant keeper, whose task it was to shine them, was still asleep. When it was time to awaken his helper, the head keeper asked him about the cleaning of the lamp and lens. The assistant was as surprised as his superior to learn that the work had already been done. The following week, it was the assistant's turn to notice the same procedure had been repeated, although neither man had performed the task. Whether or not there is another explanation, the ghosts of the two keepers lost when the old lighthouse crashed into the sea received full credit for the polishing of the lens and the lamp of Minot's ledge light. For many years, mariners sailing past the lighthouse have been insisting that they hear strange voices and see ghost-like figures clinging to the lower section of the ladder. It is said that the Portuguese fishermen, who had usually taken their compatriot Joseph Antoine out to the light to serve his turn, in later years saw the ghost of their friend many times while passing the rock. This belief became so strong that, according to Keeper Fitzpatrick, many Portuguese fishermen do not dare to venture close to the new stone tower today. It is said that the ghost of young Antoine has usually been heard and seen just prior to northeast storms, when the specter puts in an appearance apparently to warn his countrymen from the dangers of the ledge. Many sailors of a former generation are said to have heard his shrill, high-pitched tones and to have seen him grasping the lower rungs of the lighthouse ladder, with a gathering surf sweeping over him as he cried out, "Keep away! Keep away!" There are those who tell of the lighthouse keeper at the rock who was a good workman and who enjoyed his position until one day an obsession seized him. It is an absurd thought, but he was dissatisfied that there were no normal square corners in the lighthouse. The idea dwelt in his mind till at last he could stand it no longer. This individual, who until then had been perfectly content at the tower, gradually went from bad to worse. Finally, he was compelled to resign his post at this great American beacon simply because he became obsessed with the ridiculous idea that there were no square corners at the lighthouse. Another story concerns the strange tapping at the tower. In the former lighthouse, it was the custom of the head keeper to signal to his assistant by rapping on the stovepipe, which went up through the various floors, in order to inform him that the watch was over. The assistant would rap to reply that he was coming. But in the new lighthouse, an electric bell was installed to call the assistant. One night, however, something happened that has never been satisfactorily explained. As the midnight watch was drawing to a close, the head keeper was sitting in the watchroom, thinking of the destruction of the old tower. When he was about to get up, he leaned forward and tapped his pipe against the table. A few moments later, he was amazed to hear an answering tap from below, although the only other living person at the light was fast asleep. Nonplussed as what to do, he decided to wait for a few minutes. Then he tapped again, and once more from the depths of the granite structure came the answering tap. He hazarded the guess that the assistant was awake and perhaps getting dressed, so he waited. In fact, he waited for some time, yet nobody appeared. Finally, he rang the bell, the usual signal, and after a short wait received the usual reply from below. The steps of the keeper's helper were soon heard on the iron stairs, and when the assistant finally appeared, his superior recounted the weird incident. Needless to say, both men were quite startled, especially when they recalled that a tapping from below had been the signal in the old tower where the two men had perished in the great gale. The story has persisted through the years that the reason for the removal of the famous Longfellow's chair from its position of active service in front of the tower to a place of honor it later occupied near the bell on the lower parapet was the death of a lady who fell into the sea. She was being hoisted up to the landing in the chair when suddenly a great wave startled those in the boat below, causing them to release the guide rope. The chair banged against the tower halfway up, and the lady fell out and was killed. I mention this story only because it has been told and is still being told, although the episode does not seem to have any foundation in fact. A head keeper of Minot's Light once remarked, "The trouble with our life here is that we have too much time to think." Rumor has it that around 50 years ago, a new assistant keeper thought too much and decided to cut his throat with a razor. Unfortunately, he bled to death before the head keeper discovered him. When the writer interrogated a former keeper concerning the tragedy, the keeper said that he preferred not to be quoted. Another story purporting to be true concerns the assistant keeper who was working one day on the davits holding the lighthouse boat. He let himself down over the side when suddenly there was a crack and the woodwork in the bow of the dory gave way. Down fell the keeper while the boat hung by the stern. Although he struck the water below with great force, he was not seriously injured. The suggestion was put forward at the time that the dory had been weakened by someone anxious to obtain a position at the tower should a vacancy occur. About 5 years ago, Larry McDavitt of the Boston American made one of the most unusual pictures ever taken of Minot's Light. Rowed out to the vicinity of the ledge after a heavy storm in a boat in charge of the school committeeman Lee of Boston, McDavitt caught a high wave as it beat against the tower, fully 50 feet in the air. Although the picture has been published many times, the photographer has never received the credit due him, so the writer trusts that this small tribute will in some way make up for the errors of omission made by many who have used the photograph without the proper acknowledgments. There are several incidents concerning Minot's Light with which the writer has had a more or less personal connection. As it may be doubted in time to come, unless it is mentioned here, the author of this book made a dive a few years ago from the top of the ladder at the lighthouse into the water. The height was not so great as professionals attempt, but because of the element of danger which is associated with the ledge, more attention was given the incident than it deserved. November 15th, 1935, on the 75th anniversary of the first illumination of Minot's Light, a group flew over the tower from Boston. They were Thomas Johnson of Providence, Rhode Island, Charles W. Gammons, representing the town of Cohasset, George P. Tilton of the Boston Port Authority, Captain George Eaton, Superintendent of the 2nd District, U.S. Lighthouse Service, Edwin Thompson Ramsdell, photographer, Channing Howard, Winthrop historian, Dr. William Flynn of Dorchester, Mrs. Edward Snow, and the writer. The pilot was Captain William H. Winkapaw. As the plane roared over the top of the tower, Mrs. Snow scattered flowers upon the waters, where Joseph Wilson and Joseph Antoine kept their last faithful watch more than 80 years before. As he circled over the light for the last time, Captain Winkapaw brought his great plane within 40 feet of the lightning rod spindle, and the writer bombed the tower with 2 packages tied together with a 30-foot cord. As the bundles fell, the line wrapped itself around the parapet, and the 2 packages were quickly hauled up by the keepers. One bundle contained a birthday cake for the light itself, and the other package a book written by the author about the lighthouse. Perhaps the greatest thrill the writer ever experienced in connection with Minot's Light was on November 26, 1939. For several years before this, we had made futile attempts to take airplane pictures of the waves as they ran up the granite sides of the tower after a great storm. Because of the speed of the airplane and the infrequent surges of the sea, we were always too far away when a wave submerged the tower. A northeast gale had swept the coast the previous day, and shortly before noon that November Sunday, we took off from the East Boston airport with pilot Al Leckede. Others in the plane were Donald Snow and Charles Wyke. As we reached the vicinity, the seas were most intense in their fury, even surpassing the descriptions of many writers who have visited Minot's Light, but they never had the view we enjoyed that wild Sunday in November. As we reached the lighthouse, a great wave threw itself against the impregnable granite structure, surging up to the highest window under the turret. Another curled around the base of the tower, wrapping it in foam, while still another completely hid the lighthouse from view with a curtain of spray. We circled many times, snapping picture after picture, wave after wave. Then, just as we started for home, we noticed a dragger in distress, drifting toward the light. Helpless to aid the ship, we watched with relief while another dragger turned in toward the lighthouse and threw a line to the imperiled men on the drifting craft. The wind blew the line out of reach of the crew. Finally, on the third attempt, the line was made fast, and the tow to Boston began. To this day, we have heard no mention of this heroic effort, as those concerned evidently wished to avoid publicity, or perhaps it was only another unsung deed of heroism at sea. But we in the plain had watched the rescue and believe that the men in the second dragger should receive some acknowledgment for this brave act. Incidentally, the pictures taken that afternoon proved to be extremely satisfactory, and the reader will find them elsewhere in this volume. End of Stories and Legends. Read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. Section 8 of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Visit to the Light. Now that we know the history of Minot's Ledge Light, let us go for an 18-mile sail to the massive stone tower off Cohasset. We start our trip from Boston, leaving on board the excursion boat Francis, and are soon passing Castle Island, the ancient citadel of the Puritans. Passing the lighthouses of the inner harbor, we veer to starboard at Nix's Mate Island and sail down the Narrows. As island after island glides by, we soon reach the open sea. Graves Light, Boston's most powerful beacon, and Boston Light, the oldest lighthouse in America, are soon left behind as we turn at Point Allerton and head down the coast. Passing Harding's Ledge, we perceive the outline of the tower gradually coming into view, so that by the time we draw a beam of black rocks off Nantasket, Minot's Light has assumed its gigantic proportions. If we make sure to keep a straight course from the marker at Harding's Ledge to a mooring mast at the light, we shall not risk striking any rocky ledges. As we near the lighthouse, Keeper George H. Fitzpatrick comes out on the parapet of the tower to greet us and invites our party aboard. Since the ocean is exceptionally calm today, it is possible to row Captain Esterhill's tender over to the huge granite structure. Ahead of us, however, lies the most difficult part of the trip. This is the climb up the long bronze ladder to the landing halfway up the tower, and so we take great care in ascending to the topmost rung. Here we transfer our hold to the strong bronze railings which lead into the storeroom landing. To those of you who, either from inclination or necessity, remain armchair adventurers on the trip to Minot's Light, the writer suggests a close analysis of the diagram of the tower included in this volume. While we stop to rest on the first landing of the lighthouse, the keeper shows us the top of the well, which extends 40 feet down into the rock itself, 22 courses below. Here we are reminded of the story which Joe Harrington of the All Sorts column in the Boston Post tells. One day, a number of girls were being shown around the Granite Tower when Assistant Keeper Walsh came to the top of the well with them. One of the young ladies wanted to know what the well was for. Keeper Walsh, explaining that the well was 40 feet deep, facetiously remarked that it was used as a bathtub at the light. "My," said the young lady, "you must be out of luck when you drop the soap." An oil storage tank holding 1,600 gallons has been built into the storeroom. This amount would be sufficient for about 6 months. In years past, about 875 gallons of oil were consumed a year, but now that coal is no longer used, approximately 3,200 gallons are needed. Recent attempts to place an oil-burning refrigerator on this floor at the light have failed because of the narrow door, which is only 25 1/2 inches in width. At present, the men at the lighthouse are hoping that a smaller model will be available, since a refrigerator would mean a difference in the variety of food which they could have at the light. Naturally, all of the rooms in the lighthouse are circular. From the storeroom landing, we ascend the iron steps into the kitchen, where the keepers prepare and eat their meals. Each man must be a good cook, or he will indeed fare poorly. The tea kettle gently simmering on the kitchen stove reminds us that a mere male can become quite adept as a culinary artist, if he so desires. The polished brasswork and tidy appearance of the kitchen likewise speak well for the housekeeping ability of George Fitzpatrick. The keeper is very much pleased with the new stove, which was installed last spring, as the heat from the oil burner gives a much steadier warmth than the stove formerly in use. The banjo clock, probably the same one pictured in sketches of the light years ago, now hangs in the kitchen. Resuming our climb through the circular rooms, we reach the assistant keeper's quarters. The assistants, stationed at Minot's Ledge Light on December 1st, 1940, are First Assistant Patrick Brides, formerly at Musselbed Light, and Second Assistant Robert F. Hamblin, who was transferred from Nantucket Island. 2 men are always stationed at the light, with the third spending his leave ashore. There is one double-tiered iron bed with 2 bunks and several closets in which the keepers can store their personal belongings. Proceeding upward once more, we enter the sleeping quarters of head keeper George H. Fitzpatrick. He has 2 bunks similar to those of the assistant keepers, and the lockers are built into the wall. An interesting picture of the laying of the lowest block of the lighthouse, with the date July 11th, 1858, adorns the wall of the keeper's room. Keeper Fitzpatrick's quarters are on the 4th story of the tower. Here he keeps his emergency kit in case of an accident, for he must be also a doctor should the need arise. On the 5th floor is the watchroom, formerly known as the oil room, where the night's supply of oil was kept. Here we find a stove, a radio, 3 chairs, a workbench, a flat-top desk, and a telephone which connects the beacon with the mainland. The fog signal machinery is built into this room, and a clock on the wall indicates the time when the watches should be changed. Here the keeper's logbook is kept, and on the desk is the visitor's register. An important part of our trip is to sign this book, and thereby join that immortal list of visitors, which includes Admiral Dewey and Longfellow. Outside the 6th floor clock room on the parapet stands the fog signal bell, and for many years the Longfellow's chair stood beside it. The chair has recently disappeared. Although the chair is gone, the visit of Longfellow in 1871 is still recounted by the keeper. In the description of his journey out to the ledge, Longfellow speaks of the lighthouse, quote, rising sheer out of the sea, unquote. He also tells of a ride in the chair up to the landing. Ever since that occasion, the chair has been called Longfellow's chair. The poet further compares the lighthouse to a, quote, beautiful stone cannon, mouth upward, belching forth only friendly fires, unquote. The keeper tells us that 710 individuals visited the tower in 1861, 490 in 1862, and 496 in 1865, while in 1937 there were only 357 visitors. The youngest person ever to climb, or rather to be taken up Minot's Light, was Mary Helen Keith of Campello, who, at the age of 9 months, was carried to the top of the tower in August 1869. One of the oldest persons to climb the light was 74-year-old Herbert Watson Coker, who went up to the top in 1938. Back in 1871, John Tibbets, 82 of Boston, signed the book, but he was probably hoisted up in the chair. Keeper Fitzpatrick says that not more than 175 people will register in 1940, since it has been a poor year for boating. The writer believes that there are two other reasons why fewer guests call at Minot's Light. The first is that the old Longfellow's chair, which dropped the timid visitors right inside the entrance from their boat below, is no longer used. The second reason is that the loop, which on rough days was used to hoist the visitors above the waves, has similarly been discontinued. If visitors are not able to climb the 40-odd rungs of the ladder, which is occasionally slippery, they are obliged to remain below in the boat. Perhaps this may explain further why the number of visitors has diminished. In spite of all these drawbacks, the writer a few years ago was able to take up to the top of the light one of the largest groups ever to visit the ledge. On that particular occasion, more than 100 persons were aboard the excursion motorship Francis, and a good majority climbed the tower. After inspecting the machinery, we climb once more. With considerable pride, the keeper escorts us into the lantern room and removes the white linen covering, which protects the lens during the daytime. Clean and sparkling, iridescent in the rays of the sun, the myriad lenses are revealed on a gigantic frame. Within is the small Welschbach gas mantle, which is lighted by oil pumped under pressure. The flashes of light are produced by the turning of a glass cylinder on which have been constructed 8 bullseyes, or focal points. It is only when these bullseyes are at right angles to the observer on land or sea that they appear to flash their signal of 143. The cylinder itself turns by clockwork, and every hour the clock must be wound. Of course, the light itself, a steady oil-burning mantle, does not go alternately on and off. It is the revolving cylinder which gives the impression of the flashes characteristic of Minot's Light. Some technical data may be of interest. The 75,000 candle power beacon gives 1 flash, eclipse 3 seconds, 4 flashes, eclipse 4 seconds, 3 flashes, eclipse 16 seconds. Now that we have seen the mechanism of the light, the more adventurous members of our party may step outside the lantern room on the upper turret and climb the iron ladder to the very top of the edifice. On one of the writer's visits here, an assistant keeper actually did stand on the very top of the metal roof with both hands outflung. But while we remain on the deck of the upper turret and gaze across the sea at the Boston lightship a few miles away, a warning blast from the Francis comes up to us from below. Reluctantly, we realize that the sun is slowly going down in the west, and that darkness will soon settle all around us. And so we descend the stairs to the lower landing, climb down the outside ladder, and one by one step off into the waiting skiff. After we have been rowed back again to the Francis, tied at the mooring 200 feet away, we climb aboard the excursion boat and settle ourselves for the long trip homeward. As Captain Esterhill backs the vessel away from the ledge, he whistles a salute to Keeper Fitzpatrick, who answers with 3 loud strokes of the great fog bell. Sailing away, we notice that Keeper Fitzpatrick has gone inside, for the sun's rays are disappearing from the western sky, and his evening task is about to begin. Before the Francis has reached Point Allerton on our port quarter, we see the thrilling flash of Minot's famous 143 blinking at us from the tall tower, now 6 miles astern, and as the headlands of Hull shut off the gleam of Lover's Light, we think of Keeper Fitzpatrick, alone with his assistant on the isolated rock. We wonder what his reactions are during the long wintry months, especially when the violent gales roar in out of the North Atlantic and seething white-capped waves come sweeping up the sides of his lighthouse. Perhaps as the Granite Tower shakes with the impact of tremendous billows pounding on the outside of the massive structure, and the light is engulfed with foam, his thoughts are of those two keepers of the old tower who on that night, now so long ago, stood side by side in the face of almost certain death to keep their last faithful watch that ended in eternity. End of A Visit to the Light, read by Mark Harrington, Framingham, Massachusetts. End of The Story of Minot's Light by Edward Rowe Snow.